Bramwell Sutter leaned across Lenora Whitlock's kitchen table like he owned the air inside her walls. He didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed open her front door with 2 fingers, the way a man pushes open a door he's already decided belongs to him. And he walked in trailing mud across her clean floor and dropped a folded document in front of her coffee cup without a word. Then he pulled out a chair, her husband's chair, the one nobody had sat in since Edmund died, and lowered himself into it like he was sitting down at his own breakfast table. "Read it," he said. Lenora didn't touch the paper. "You walked into my house without being asked," she said. "You sat in that chair without being asked. And now you want me to read something you didn't even have the courtesy to hand me properly." She looked at him. "Get out of that chair, Mr. Sutter." He smiled. It was the kind of smile that had nothing warm behind it. "Mrs. Whitlock, you're a widow woman running a cattle operation on 280 acres of land your late husband barely managed to hold together. I'm trying to save you from what comes next." "What comes next?" "Winter." He tapped the document. "And the fact that your water rights aren't worth the paper Edmund Whitlock paid a Billings lawyer to file them on." Lenora felt the floor shift under her feet, but she kept her face still. "Get out of that chair," she said again, quiet as a closing door. "If this kind of story grips you, stubborn women, scheming men, and the unexpected stranger who changes everything, then you are exactly where you belong. Subscribe the channel right now so you never miss what comes next. Hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me the city and country where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels." Now let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what Bramwell Sutter started that morning, you need to know who Lenora Whitlock really was. The storm came on a Thursday. Lenora remembered that clearly afterward, not because Thursdays meant anything particular, but because she had planned to ride the north fence line that afternoon and check the section near the creek where Edmund had always said the posts ran shallow. She never made it to the fence. By noon, the sky had gone the color of a bruise, and by 2 o'clock the wind was pulling at the barn doors hard enough to make the hinges shriek. She got her ranch hands moving before the first lightning hit. Hector Vega, who had worked the Whitlock property since before Edmund bought it, knew what to do without being told. He and his nephew Duro drove the cattle into the south pasture, where the tree line would break the worst of the wind, and they double-latched every stall. Lenora herself went up into the loft to throw down extra hay and tie off the loose tarp that had been flapping all week above the feed storage. She should have fixed that tarp 2 weeks ago. She knew it then, and she knew it while she was knotting the rope in the dark, with rain already beginning to spit through the gaps in the siding. The farmhouse held through the first hour. Then something above her head gave a crack like a rifle shot, and a section of the kitchen ceiling opened up and let in the sky. Not all at once. It was worse than that. It was one beam giving way first, then the groan of everything around it shifting to compensate, and then 3 feet of roofing shingles peeling back like a page being turned, and the rain coming in gray and cold and immediate. Lenora grabbed the pot from the stove and shoved it under the worst of the drip. But that was ridiculous, and she knew it was ridiculous. A pot didn't fix what she was looking at. She stood in her kitchen in the middle of a Montana storm and looked up at the hole in her roof and made herself think clearly instead of panicking, which took longer than she would have liked. The hole was bad, but it wasn't the whole roof. The rest of it was holding, at least for now. She needed someone who could tell her how bad it really was and not lie to her about it. That was harder to find than she expected. Briar Mesa was not a large town. It had a livery, a dry goods store, a land office that doubled as a telegraph station, a saloon that served decent food if you asked before 6 in the evening, and enough gossip to keep 3 towns going. It also had 2 carpenters. The first one, a man named Pollard, came out the day after the storm, walked around the outside of the farmhouse twice, told Lenora the damage looked manageable, quoted her a price that would have set her back 2 months' operating budget, and then spent 40 minutes in the saloon telling 3 separate people that the Whitlock widow would be selling before autumn. Lenora heard about this because Briar Mesa was not a large town. She didn't call Pollard back. The second name came from Hector, who mentioned it carefully, the way he mentioned things he wasn't sure Lenora would want to hear. "There's a man been working out at the Delaney place," Hector said. "Holloway, Cade Holloway, fixed their whole east wing after that same storm took the gable off. Delaney said he was honest about what needed doing." "Honest how?" Lenora asked. "Told them the gable couldn't be patched. Had to come off and be rebuilt. Delaney didn't want to hear it, but Holloway was right. The patch would have held for one season and then cost twice as much to fix properly. Lenora thought about her kitchen ceiling and the pot under the drip and said, "Find out if he's still in the area." Cade Holloway showed up on a Friday morning riding a sorrel mare that looked like she'd seen some distance and carried canvas tools in a canvas pack tied behind the saddle. He was younger than Lenora expected, 31. She found out later, though that morning he looked somewhere in the vicinity of someone who had worked hard and slept rough and wasn't bothered by either. He had dark eyes and a jaw that needed attention from a razor, and the kind of quiet that isn't shyness so much as habit, the quiet of a man who had spent more time working alone than talking. He tied his mare at the post, looked at the farmhouse, and then looked at Lenora standing on the porch. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said. "Mr. Holloway." She came down the porch steps. "The damage is mostly in the kitchen. Part of the ceiling came through." "I'll need to go up on the roof," he said. "See what's underneath before I can tell you what you're really dealing with." "That's what I want to know," she said. "What I'm really dealing with." He held her gaze for a moment. All right, he went up. He was up there for almost an hour. Lenora went back inside and tried to focus on the accounts she'd been avoiding, but she found herself listening to his footsteps, moving across the roof, careful, methodical, stopping in places that worried her because she couldn't tell what he was finding. Hector came by twice to check on things, and both times gave the roof a glance and shrugged, which was not reassuring. When Cade came back down, he didn't smile and tell her it wasn't as bad as it looked. He stood on her porch and said, "There's a support beam under the damaged section that's been rotting for a while. The storm finished what was already starting. I can patch the roof. I can make it look fine, and it'll probably hold through the summer." Lenora waited. "But if we get another hard storm before that beam gets addressed, you could lose half the roof, not just the kitchen section. And the next storm won't warn you first." She looked at him. "Why are you telling me this instead of just patching it and taking your money?" Cade seemed to think about that for a moment, like the question deserved a real answer. "Because you asked me what you were really dealing with," he said. "That's what you're really dealing with." Lenora nodded slowly. "What does rebuilding it properly cost?" he told her. She didn't flinch, even though the number landed in her chest like something heavy. "How long? 2 weeks if the weather holds, maybe 3. Can you start Monday?" "I can start Monday." She didn't know anything about Cade Holloway, except what she'd heard secondhand from Hector, which wasn't much. He'd worked ranch jobs across 3 territories, Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, and had picked up carpentry somewhere along the way, well enough to make it his primary income. He didn't seem to have a permanent address. He'd been boarding at the Delaney spread while he finished their gable, and now he'd need somewhere to stay. Lenora had a bunkhouse. It had 3 empty bunks since her last 2 full-time ranch hands had moved on in February, leaving only Hector and Duro. She offered it plainly, as a business arrangement, and Cade accepted it the same way. He showed up Monday before she had finished her morning coffee. She watched him from the kitchen window while she drank. He'd already unloaded his tools and was up on the roof again before 7, moving with the particular kind of focus that people have when they know exactly what they're doing and don't need an audience. Lenora found herself appreciating that. She had spent 18 months being surrounded by people who either doubted her competence or performed their helpfulness loudly so she'd notice it. Cade Holloway didn't perform anything. He just worked. The morning Sutter came was Cade's 4th day on the property. Cade was up on the roof, so he heard the horse coming up the drive but couldn't see who it was until he moved to the edge and looked down. He saw a big man on a gray horse, expensive gray horse, the kind of horse that announces money without trying, and 2 riders behind him who didn't look like ranch hands. Ranch hands sat loose in the saddle. These 2 sat like men whose job was to watch. He didn't come down. It wasn't his house. But he stayed close to the edge where he could hear. He heard most of it. The front door opening, not a knock, just the door opening, and then Sutter's voice, which carried the way voices do when they've spent years accustomed to rooms falling quiet. Cade couldn't make out every word, but he caught the shape of it. Offer. Water rights. Document. And then Lenora's voice, lower, steadier than he expected. Then get out of that chair. Said twice, same tone both times. Not louder. Just final. A long pause. Then boots on the porch floor and the front door again, and Sutter and his 2 men riding back down the drive. Cade went back to work. An hour later, Lenora came out of the house and stood in the yard below and looked up at him. "You heard some of that," she said. It wasn't a question. Enough to know the shape of it, he said. Bramwell Sutter. He owns most of the cattle operation on the eastern end of the county. She shielded her eyes against the morning glare. He wants this ranch because the creek crossing on the south boundary would connect two parcels of his that are otherwise separated by about 12 miles of difficult terrain. And the water rights business? She was quiet for a moment. He's claiming my late husband's filing is defective, that the documentation is insufficient. She paused. He left a copy of his argument with me. Have you read it? 3 times. And? She looked up at him with the particular expression of someone who is not certain but is not going to say so. I think he may be wrong, but I also know that may be wrong and provably wrong are different things when you're a woman trying to hold a water right in a territory where men like Sutter have the ear of every official within 50 miles. Cade looked back at the beam he'd been reinforcing. He thought about what she said for a moment. You need a lawyer, he said. I know, not a local one. She looked at him. I know that too. She wrote the letter that afternoon. Lenora was not the kind of woman who spent a long time deciding to do difficult things. Once she understood what needed doing, she did it. The letter went to a territorial attorney in Billings named Graham Holt, who had a reputation for taking on water rights cases and not being afraid of large landowners. She'd heard the name from her late husband, who had considered consulting Holt 2 years ago about a different boundary question, before deciding it wasn't necessary. Edmund's instinct for deciding things weren't necessary had cost them both a fair amount. She sent the letter with Duro on the afternoon stage and didn't tell anyone else about it. That same evening, Cade was washing up at the pump when she came out to tell him supper was on if he wanted it. She'd started doing that 3 days ago, extending the invitation like a practical matter rather than a social one. He ate with her and Hector and Duro most evenings now, sitting at the long table in the kitchen with the patched ceiling above them and the smell of sawdust that seemed to follow Cade indoors. What did your husband die of? Cade asked that evening, not looking up from his plate. The table went briefly quiet. Hector examined his fork. Lenora didn't seem bothered by the question. Pneumonia, she said. January of last year. He was sick 3 weeks before he admitted it was serious, and by then it was too late to do much about it. She reached for the bread. Edmund was not a man who acknowledged his own limits until they'd already beaten him. Cade nodded, didn't push further. He was a good man, she said, not defensively, just as fact. Better at buying cattle than managing money. Better at being kind than being practical. I loved him. She looked at her plate. But I've had to spend 1.5 years fixing decisions he thought were fine. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Hector said, he chose good land, which was the most generous thing he could honestly say, and Lenora smiled at him like she knew exactly what he was doing. The second week of Cade's work brought 3 things in rapid succession. The first was that Cade, without being asked, and without mentioning it on his bill, repaired the broken hinge on the main corral gate. It had been hanging wrong for months. The gate wouldn't close flush, so it had to be propped shut with a post, which meant every time someone went in or out they had to move the post and then replace it, which everyone had simply accepted as a permanent irritation. One morning Lenora walked out and the gate swung clean and latched properly. She asked Hector about it. Hector said Holloway fixed it yesterday evening. She didn't say anything to Cade about it directly, but she noticed. The second thing was that a neighboring rancher named Cal Burris rode over on a Tuesday morning, ostensibly to discuss borrowing Lenora's bull for the season. But actually it became clear within 5 minutes to tell her that Sutter had been talking. Sutter had been telling people in town that Lenora's water rights question was all but settled against her, and that the practical, sensible thing for Mrs. Whitlock to do was accept a fair offer before the territory attorneys got involved, and the whole thing became expensive and drawn out and unpleasant. He used the word fair, Burris said, standing in Lenora's yard with his hat in his hands. 3 times. Every time somebody uses fair that many times, it means the opposite. I know, Lenora said. You got somebody looking at the filing? I've been in contact with someone in Billings. Burris nodded. He was a weathered man in his 50s who had been ranching the Briar Mesa area for 20 years and had watched Sutter buy up half the county piece by piece. Be careful, he said, not unkindly. Sutter doesn't like losing. When he loses the legal argument, he looks for another angle. After Burris left, Lenora stood in her yard for a long moment. Cade was at the far end of the property, reinforcing the barn doors, which was also not on his original bill. She could see him across the distance, the motion of a man working steadily, not rushing, not performing. She thought about what Burris had said. Another angle. The third thing that happened in the second week was harder to describe and easier to understand once you'd felt it yourself. It was a Tuesday evening, later than usual, and Lenora was still at the kitchen table with the ranch account spread in front of her when she heard Cade come in from the bunkhouse to get his jacket, which he'd left on the peg by the door. She heard him stop. "You've been at those same numbers for 3 hours," he said from the doorway. "How do you know how long I've been at them?" "I could see the lamp from the bunkhouse window." She rubbed her eyes. "The spring sale figures don't add up to what they should. I keep getting the same shortfall, and I can't find where it's coming from." He was quiet for a moment. "You want another set of eyes?" She looked at him. "Do you know accounts?" "I know enough. Ranch finances aren't complicated if you lay them out right." He came in, got his jacket off the peg, and then instead of leaving, draped it over the back of Edmund's chair and looked at her in a way that asked permission. She moved over. He sat down, not in Edmund's chair, she noticed, but in the one next to her. He looked at the columns for a while without speaking, and she found herself watching his face while he read, which she was aware was not useful behavior. "Here," he said after a few minutes, pointing to a column. "Your feed cost for February is in twice. Different handwriting. So either you entered it and then someone else entered it again, or Hector does some of the entries," she said slowly. "He would have thought I'd forgotten. There it is." She stared at it. It was so simple. She had been staring at these numbers for 3 hours, and it was that simple. "I could have found that myself," she said. "Sure," he said, standing up and picking up his jacket. "But sometimes you need someone else's eyes. Nothing wrong with that." He left. She sat there for a moment longer than necessary, not looking at the accounts. The letter from Graham Holt in Billings arrived 12 days after she sent hers. Lenora read it twice, standing at the kitchen window, then sat down and read it a third time at the table. Holt's assessment was cautious but directional. The filing, he wrote, appeared to be legitimate on its face. But the territorial recording had a procedural gap, a notarization step, that the Billings office routinely required had either been skipped or the documentation had been misfiled. It was not fatal to her claim, Holt said carefully, but it was a genuine weakness that Sutter's attorneys would exploit if it went to a formal hearing. Holt could address it. He would need to come to Briar Mesa to review the originals, and he would need to file a corrective affidavit with the Territorial Land Office. He quoted a fee that was serious but not catastrophic. He recommended moving quickly. Lenora put the letter on the table and stared at it. Cade came in to tell her he'd need another day on the windmill before it was properly set. He'd found a cracked coupling that needed replacing. She looked up at him and said, "Sit down a minute." Something in her voice made him sit. She told him what Holt had said, not because she owed him an explanation, but because she had gotten into the habit, without fully noticing, of thinking through difficult things out loud to Cade. He listened without interrupting, which was another habit she had noticed and appreciated. "He's right about moving fast," Cade said. "If Sutter's attorneys get to a hearing before Holt files the correction, they can argue the defect was never remedied." Lenora looked at him. "How do you know about territorial filing procedures?" He was quiet for a moment. "I worked a spread in Wyoming for 2 years where the owner was fighting a water right dispute. Watched the whole thing play out." He looked at his hands. "He lost because he was too slow. What happened to the ranch?" "Sold. Owner moved his family to Oregon." Lenora nodded once, slowly, the way she nodded when she was deciding something. "I'm going to wire Holt today and tell him to come as soon as possible. You need Duro to go to town? I'll ride myself." She stood. "Thank you for listening." "I didn't do anything," he said. "You listened without telling me what to do," she said. "That's more than most people manage." She rode to town and sent the wire. She was coming back along the main road toward the ranch when she passed Sutter's man, Guilford Crane, going the opposite direction. Crane was Sutter's ranch foreman. A thick-shouldered man with small eyes who had always looked at Lenora the way men look at problems they expect someone else to solve. He slowed his horse as she approached. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said. "Mr. Sutter wanted me to inquire whether you'd had more time to consider his offer." "Tell Mr. Sutter I'm not interested in his offer," she said pleasantly. Crane smiled with his mouth only. "He thought you might say that. He asked me to mention that the Territorial Land Office in Helena has already been notified of the filing irregularity. These things can move fast once they get official attention." Lenora kept her face still. "Thank you, Mr. Crane." She rode on. She didn't look back, but her jaw was clenched so tight it ached for the rest of the way home. She told Cade about Crane when she got back. She didn't mean to. She got off her horse, and he was right there in the yard, and it came out of her before she could arrange it properly. Cade's expression didn't change much, but his eyes went somewhere harder. "He's moving to pressure the land office before your attorney gets here," he said. "Yes." "When did you say Holt could get here?" I asked for next week. "Monday, if he can manage it." Cade thought for a moment. "That's tight." "I know." "Can you wire him and ask him to come sooner, even Friday?" "I can try." She paused. "He has other clients. He may not understand how fast Sutter can move." Cade's voice was flat. "Men like Sutter have people in offices who owe them favors. It doesn't take much to accelerate a bureaucratic process when you know which desk to push." Lenora looked at him. In the 18 months since Edmund died, a good number of people had told her to be careful, to be patient, to trust that things would work out. Nobody had talked to her like the situation was real and urgent and required actual strategy. "I'll wire him again," she said. She went inside. Cade stood in the yard for another moment, looking at nothing in particular, his jaw working slightly. Then he went back to the barn and the cracked windmill coupling and worked until it was too dark to see. He was still out there when Lenora blew out her kitchen lamp for the night. She noticed the light still on in the barn. She told herself it wasn't her business and went to bed. But she lay there for a while in the dark, listening to the wind off the mountains, thinking about a Wyoming rancher who'd been too slow and had moved his family to Oregon. She wasn't going to Oregon. She'd burned every bridge that pointed east the day she decided to stay after Edmund died, and she wasn't sorry about any of it. But lying there in the dark, she admitted to herself, just in that moment, where no one else could see it, that she was scared. Not of Sutter, exactly. Not of the legal battle. Scared of what it would feel like if she did everything right and still lost. That was the fear you couldn't say out loud. That was the one you had to carry alone. In the morning, the wire to Holt went out with Duro on the early stage. Cade replaced the windmill coupling, and the windmill turned clean for the first time in weeks. Water pushing up steady from the well below, and Lenora stood watching it from across the yard, with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands. Hector came up beside her. "He does good work," he said. "Yes," she said. "He fixes things he's not getting paid to fix." I noticed. Hector was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Edmund hired 2 men like that over the years. Both of them left soon as better money came along somewhere else." Lenora looked at him. "I'm just saying," Hector said, not quite meeting her eyes. "A man who fixes things because he notices they're broken is different from a man who fixes them because you asked. But different doesn't mean he stays." Lenora drank the rest of her cold coffee. "Thank you, Hector," she said, which was how she ended conversations she didn't want to continue. He nodded and walked off toward the corrals. She stood there watching the windmill turn, water running steady, the morning light coming off the peaks to the west, turning the whole yard a color between gold and white. She had a lawsuit coming, a cattle baron maneuvering against her, an attorney writing from Billings, and a cowboy on her roof who repaired things nobody asked him to fix. She thought she knew the price of all of it, except possibly the last. Holt arrived on a Friday. He came in on the afternoon stage from Billings, a compact man in his mid-40s, with a dark traveling coat and a leather satchel that looked like it had been to more courtrooms than most lawyers. He wasn't what Lenora expected, which was something louder and more self-important. Holt was quiet and precise and shook her hand like she was a colleague rather than a client, which she appreciated immediately. She had Duro bring him out to the ranch in the wagon, while she rode ahead to make sure the kitchen was set up for working, the table cleared, the original filing documents laid out in the order she'd organized them, the lamp positioned where it would give the best light for reading small print. She'd been over the documents herself a dozen times in the past 2 weeks. She knew where the weakness was, or thought she did, and she wanted to see if Holt found the same place. He did. Within 20 minutes of sitting down at her kitchen table, he had his finger on the notarization gap and was reading the surrounding documents with the focused attention of someone who had seen this pattern before. "Your husband's attorney in Billings," Holt said, not looking up. "Farnsworth?" "That's right. Farnsworth was competent, but he retired in '83. His office closed down mid-year, and some of his filings from that period ended up mislabeled in the territorial records. Yours isn't the first case I've seen where his work had a procedural gap for that reason." He looked up. which means Sutter's people knew exactly where to look. Lenora went still. They've done this before. I'd be surprised if they haven't. Holt sat back slightly. The good news is the underlying right is solid. Your husband filed legitimately. The water usage is documented. The creek boundary is clear. This is a paperwork problem, not a substantive one. And the bad news? Paperwork problems still require paperwork solutions. I need to file a corrective affidavit with the Territorial Land Office in Helena, and I need to do it before Sutter's attorneys formally challenge the filing. He looked at his documents. How quickly can you get me notarized copies of the original survey and the creek boundary markers? I have the survey. The boundary markers were recorded with the county when Edmund bought the property. Good. I'll need someone at the county recorder's office to pull the record. Is there anyone there you trust? She thought about it. The deputy recorder is a woman named Ada Frisch. She's been there 8 years and she doesn't like Sutter. Her family's property borders his on the north side. She paused. I can ask her. Do it quietly, Holt said. Don't let it be known that you're pulling records. If Sutter's people are watching the land office, a formal request might tip them off before we're ready. Cade was in the doorway. Neither of them had heard him come in. He'd finished for the day and come to get water. And he was standing there with his hat in his hand, looking at Lenora with a question in his eyes. She made a small motion with her head that meant, come in. It's all right. He came to the table, filled his cup from the pitcher, and stood listening. Holt glanced at him. Cade Holloway, Lenora said. He's been working the roof. He has some background with water right disputes. Holt nodded, the brief acknowledgement of a man who didn't waste time on pleasantries. The other complication, he said, returning to his papers, is that I have word from a contact in Helena that someone filed an inquiry with the Territorial Land Office 10 days ago, raising questions about this property's water documentation. Sutter, Lenora said. Almost certainly. They didn't file a formal challenge, not yet. An inquiry is softer. It plants a flag without committing to a position. What it does is put the property on the office's informal watch list, which means any routine transaction touching this water right now gets a second look. Cade set down his cup. Can they accelerate the inquiry into a formal challenge without warning? Holt looked at him with mild recalibration, a lawyer, encountering someone who understood the process. They can, if they have a sympathetic ear at the office, which Sutter may. So we're working against a clock we can't see clearly, Cade said. That's a reasonable way to put it. Lenora looked at both of them. What do we need to do, and in what order? They worked at the kitchen table until nearly 9 o'clock that night. Holt laid out the sequence, the county records first, quietly, through Ada Frisch, if Lenora could arrange it. Then a sworn affidavit from Lenora about the water usage, how long, how consistently, what the ranch depended on it, for which would support the corrective filing. Then Holt himself would take the completed package to Helena and file in person, because a postal filing could be delayed in ways a personal filing couldn't. He could stay through the weekend. He needed to return to Billings by Tuesday at the latest. That gives us 3 days, Lenora said. 2.5, Holt said. I want to leave Monday morning. After Holt retired to the spare room, Lenora and Cade were left at the kitchen table with the lamp burning low and the sound of wind across the mountain passes coming through the window she'd left cracked. She was tired in the particular way that comes not from physical work, but from holding yourself together for hours in front of someone you need to appear competent to. She didn't say that. She just sat with her elbows on the table and her hands around a cup of coffee that had gone cold. He's good, Cade said. Yes, he's right about the clock. I know. She looked at the document still spread across the table. Sutter has been patient for 3 months. He made his offer. I refused. He filed the inquiry. He sent Crane to remind me. Now he's waiting. He's waiting for you to make a mistake, Cade said. Or run out of money. Both are possible. She said flatly, without self-pity. Cade turned his cup in his hands. You're not going to run out of money. You don't know my accounts. I know you haven't run out yet, and you've been doing this alone for 18 months. He set the cup down. That's not nothing. She looked at him across the table. Why are you still here, Cade? He met her eyes without flinching, but she could see something move through them, not guilt exactly. More like the expression of a man who has been waiting for a question and still isn't ready for it. The roof isn't finished, he said. The roof has been finished enough for a week, and you know it. She wasn't accusing him. She was just saying the true thing. You've been finding other things to fix. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, The wind moved through the yard, and the windmill he'd repaired turned steadily, faintly audible even from here. "I've been finding other things to fix," he said at last, which was not an explanation but was at least an agreement. Lenora nodded. Didn't push further. "Good night, Cade," she said, and picked up the lamp. Saturday passed in a blur of careful, quiet movement. Lenora rode to town in the morning alone, without telling anyone where she was going except Hodder nodded, like he understood there were things that didn't need explaining. She found Ada Frisch at the county recorder's office, which was open Saturday mornings for deed transactions. Ada was a narrow-faced woman with gray-streaked hair, pulled back severely, and the expression of someone who'd spent 8 years making sure other people's paperwork was in order and had stopped expecting gratitude for it. Lenora didn't beat around the bush. She told Ada what she needed and approximately why she needed it. Ada listened without interrupting. When Lenora finished, Ada said, "Sutter's man Crane was in here 2 weeks ago asking about your property." Lenora kept her face still. What was he asking? Whether there'd been any irregularities in the filing history. Routine question, supposedly. But Crane never does routine. Ada opened her filing drawer. "I'll get you the county records. Give me half an hour. Come back at 11. Thank you, Ada. Don't thank me. Sutter bought the parcels on the north side of my father's property in '79 and drove him off on a grazing rights argument that never should have held." She was already moving toward the back of the office. "I've been waiting 8 years for someone to make him answer for something." Lenora left and walked to the dry goods store and spent 30 minutes buying supplies she didn't particularly need, because a woman who had ridden to town to buy flour and salt looked a great deal more innocent than a woman who had ridden to town to pull legal records. When she came back to the recorder's office at 11, Ada had a sealed envelope waiting for her. "The originals stay here," Ada said quietly. "What I've given you is a certified copy, properly notarized. If it goes to a hearing, I can testify to the records." "I hope it doesn't go to a hearing," Lenora said. "So do I." Ada handed her the envelope. "But if it does, I'll be there." Back at the ranch, Holt examined the certified copies for 2 hours while Lenora wrote her sworn affidavit at the other end of the table. The affidavit was harder than she expected, not because she didn't know what to say, but because putting it in legal language required a precision that felt wrong for something she simply lived. The creek had watered this ranch since before Edmund bought it. The water had run through these pastures every spring and summer for as long as anyone had records. Saying it in legal sentences made it sound uncertain, which was infuriating. Cade came in around midday and set a plate of sandwiches on the corner of the table without being asked, because he'd made them, and there was nobody else to eat them. Holt looked up briefly with the expression of a man reminded that he hadn't eaten. "Thank you," Holt said. "Don't mention it," Cade said, and went back outside. Holt watched him go. "How long has he been here?" "Nearly 3 weeks," Lenora said. Holt returned to his papers. He didn't ask anything else. But the question had landed in the room and stayed there. By Sunday evening, Holt had what he needed. He spent 2 hours after supper organizing the package for Helena, the corrective affidavit, the county records Ada had certified, Lenora's sworn statement, and his own legal brief, laying out the argument that the filing defect was procedural rather than substantive, and had been present from the beginning, through no fault of the property owner. It was careful, thorough work, and watching him assemble it gave Lenora the first real sense of calm she'd had in 2 weeks. "What are his chances of blocking this?" she asked. Holt considered. "If I get to Helena Tuesday and file in person, and if the land office processes it before his formal challenge is submitted, his lawyers will have to argue around a completed corrective record rather than an open defect. That's a much harder argument." He paused. He could still challenge it. But challenge costs money and time, and men like Sutter prefer wins that don't require a fight. "He might not walk away just because it gets difficult," Cade said from the other side of the table. He'd been sitting quietly for the last hour, not contributing much, but listening in that thorough way of his. "No," Holt agreed. "He might not. If he has a personal attachment to this particular property." "He does," Lenora said. "The creek crossing. Without it, his eastern parcels are essentially landlocked from his main operation. Then he may fight regardless." Holt straightened his papers. "Which means you should be prepared for this to continue past the filing." "I understand." After Holt went to bed, the kitchen was quiet again. Cade didn't leave immediately. He sat at the table with a cup of water, looking at the window, which had gone full dark, with the kind of deep Montana night that erases the world past 10 feet. If he keeps fighting after the filing, Cade said, it gets expensive. I know. You have enough to hold through a prolonged dispute? Lenora set her jaw slightly. I'll figure it out. He didn't push. He'd learned by now that certain doors she kept shut, not because she didn't trust him, but because she'd decided that she would not let this problem be anything other than manageable, and saying out loud that it might not be manageable would make it so. Okay, he said. Just that. She looked at him. You're not going to tell me it'll be fine? No, he said. It might not be fine, but you'll handle it either way. He stood up. Good night, Lenora. He'd called her by her first name exactly twice before, both times, without seeming to notice he'd done it. He noticed this time. She could see it in the small pause after the word, the way he didn't look back as he went out the door. She sat alone in the kitchen for a while after that. The lamp made the room warm and small against all that dark outside. You could hear the windmill. She thought about what Hector had said, about men who fix things because they notice, and about how different doesn't mean he stays. She knew Hector was right. She also knew she was past the point of pretending she hadn't noticed what was happening. Whatever she was going to do about it, which was probably nothing, because the timing was terrible, and she had a water rights dispute to win first. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. Holt left Monday morning on the early stage, shaking Lenora's hand at the door and promising to wire her from Helena the moment the filing was complete. He shook Cade's hand too, which surprised everyone, including Cade. Hold the line here, Holt said to both of them, which wasn't exactly attorney language, but it was what he said. The wagon taking him to the stage stop disappeared down the drive, and Lenora stood in the yard watching it go. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of clear that comes after a front passes and leaves everything scrubbed and sharp-edged. Now we wait, she said. Now we wait, Cade agreed. She went inside. He went back to the barn, where he'd been working on reinforcing the upper wallboards. He'd found a section where the original framing was undersized for the load it was carrying. He hadn't mentioned it on any bill. He'd just been doing it. She knew because she'd walked through the barn 2 days ago and seen the new framing work, clean and solid against the older boards around it. She hadn't said anything then either. Some things you just let happen. Sutter came back on Wednesday. This time he sent Crane instead of coming himself, which Lenora understood as a different kind of pressure. Sutter in person was an offer. Crane was a message. Crane rode into the yard at mid-morning, while Cade was on the barn roof and Hector was moving cattle in the south pasture. Duro was in town for supplies. It was just Lenora in the yard, coming back from checking the east fence line, dusty and riding tired from a long morning. Crane stopped his horse in the middle of the yard like he owned the space. Mr. Sutter asked me to deliver something, he said, and held out an envelope. Lenora stayed on her horse. She looked at the envelope but didn't reach for it. You can put it on the fence post, she said. I'll get it when I dismount. Something crossed Crane's face, not quite anger, more the look of a man unaccustomed to being made to feel small. He leaned over and tucked the envelope under the top rail of the fence post. Mr. Sutter's revised offer, he said. He's increased it by 10%. He believes it represents a more than fair value given the current uncertainty surrounding the property's water documentation. Tell Mr. Sutter thank you for his generosity, Lenora said, still not moving. And tell him I'm not selling. Crane looked at her for a long moment. He had small eyes that sat too close together, and the particular stillness of a man who was deciding how much to say. Mrs. Whitlock, you're a smart woman. Don't let stubbornness cost you the one thing you've got left to sell. Get off my property, Mr. Crane, she said, not loudly. She said it the way she said most things, level, clear, without decoration. Crane turned his horse. At the yard gate, he stopped and looked back. The land office moves slow, he said. Sutter's people move faster, he rode out. Lenora stayed on her horse until Crane was gone from sight. Then she dismounted, took the envelope from the fence post, and tore it in half without opening it. She was still standing there holding the torn halves when Cade appeared from the side of the barn. He'd come down off the roof and walked over, not rushing but not slow either. Crane, he said. Yes, what did he say? She held up the torn envelope. He looked at it for a moment, then looked at her face. You all right? He said. He told me the land office moves slow and Sutter's people move faster. She dropped the torn envelope in the dirt. He's not wrong about the land office moving slow. Holt said he'd file in person. He said he'd try to file Tuesday. We haven't had a wire. That sat between them for a moment. I'll ride to town, Cade said. Check if anything came on the stage. She looked at him. You don't have to do that. I know, he said, and went to saddle his horse. He was back within 2 hours. The wire from Holt had been sitting at the telegraph office since Monday evening. Lenora read it standing in the yard while Cade held both horses. Filed in person Tuesday 3 p.m. Stop corrective record. Complete stop land office. Confirmation copy to follow by post-stop Sutter attorneys on Reddit office. Same day stop advise caution stop Holt. She read it twice. He filed, she said. And Sutter's attorneys were there the same day, Cade said. He'd read it over her shoulder without asking. They knew he was coming. Or they've had someone watching the office. Lenora folded the wire and put it in her coat pocket. Holt got there first. This time, she looked at him. You think it's not over, do you? She thought about Crane's face when he said the land office moves slow. She thought about a man patient enough to plant an inquiry and wait 3 months. She thought about Cal Burris saying Sutter doesn't like losing. He looks for another angle. No, she said, I don't think it's over. The next angle came from a direction she hadn't anticipated. Came from inside her own operation, which was the worst kind of discovery. It was Hector who found it, which was both a relief and a wound relief because it was Hector, who she trusted absolutely, and a wound because it meant someone closest enough to know their routines had been talking to Sutter's people. What Hector found was that one of their temporary hands, a young man named Pete Reeves, who had helped with the spring branding and stayed on through May, had been seen twice in the past week talking with one of Sutter's regular riders near the creek boundary. Seen by a neighboring family's boy who'd mentioned it casually to his mother, who'd mentioned it to Hector while he was buying grain. Briar Mesa was not a large town. Information moved the way water moved, finding the lowest ground without being guided. Hector told Lenora on a Thursday afternoon, standing in the barn doorway with his hat in his hand, which was how he stood when he was telling her something that was going to make her angry. She was angry. Not at Hector, at the situation at Sutter, at the fact that she'd been watched from inside her own fence line. What does Reeves know, she said. He would have seen the attorney visit, Hector said. He was here that weekend. He might know about the records pull, if he overheard anything. Lenora thought about what Reeves could have heard. She and Holt had talked at the kitchen table, with the window cracked. Anyone close enough to the house could have caught pieces of it. Send him off, she said, today. Pay him what is owed and send him off. Hector nodded. And the information he's already passed? We assume Sutter knows about Holt's visit. We assume he knows we've been gathering records. We work as if they have eyes on everything and we don't stop. She looked at him. This doesn't change what we've already done. It just means we're more careful going forward. Hector left to handle it. Cade was in the barn working and had heard most of it. When Lenora turned around, he was sitting on a hay bale with a piece of harness in his hands, not pretending he hadn't been listening. Don't say anything reassuring, she said. I wasn't going to, he said. Good. She sat down on the bale across from him. She was tired in a way that went past the body. He's been patient, and he's been thorough, and he has more money than I do, and more people and better access to officials. I keep winning individual moments, and I can feel him not minding. Cade turned the harness piece in his hands. He didn't speak immediately, which she had come to understand meant he was thinking, rather than stuck. He's not winning individual moments, Cade said finally. You've kept the property, you've filed the correction, you've got a documented record of his inquiry that any territorial court would see as pressure tactics. He's maneuvering. He hasn't taken anything. He hasn't needed to yet. No. Cade set the harness down, but at some point maneuvering costs him too. If he goes to a formal challenge after a filed correction, he's going to court against a property owner with clean documentation and a reputable Billings attorney. That's not nothing. Unless he makes this about something other than the water rights, Lenora said. Cade looked at her. What do you mean? She was quiet for a moment. Crane said the one thing I have left to sell. He wasn't talking about the water rights, he was talking about the whole ranch. If he can't win on the water rights, he might come at something else. A mortgage question, a tax dispute, a boundary challenge. She shook her head. I don't know what Edmund's paperwork looks like on all of it. I'm still finding things. Can Holt look at the full property record? I can ask him. She stood up. She didn't want to sit still. I feel like I'm defending a perimeter I can't fully see. Cade stood too. They were closer than they usually stood, because the barn was dim and the space between the bales was narrow, and neither of them moved back. Then you need more people on your side of the perimeter, he said. Holt for the legal side, Ada Frisch for the records. Burris, you said he's watched Sutter buy up the county. Has he ever considered that other ranchers are in the same position? Lenora looked at him. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that Sutter's power comes partly from isolating people. He picks off properties one at a time because the people losing them aren't talking to each other. He paused. What if they were? She was quiet for a long moment. It was the kind of idea that seemed obvious once someone said it, and the fact that nobody had said it before, and the fact that nobody had said it before probably meant everyone was too tired and too scared and too busy surviving individually to think about it collectively. Cal Burris, she said slowly. Ada Frisch's family on the north side. There's the Clement family east of town Sutter. Bought half their pasture in '82 on a questionable grazing agreement. She was thinking out loud now. Mrs. Delaney said her husband's been worried about his eastern boundary since Sutter expanded. You know these people, Cade said. They know you. They'd need a reason to talk to each other that isn't just complaining. You're giving them a reason, he said. You're fighting and you're not losing. That's a reason. She looked at him for a moment longer than was entirely practical. When did you become a strategist? She said. Something flickered across his face. I've been drifting a long time. You think a lot when you're drifting, about what works and what doesn't. He looked away. Never had a reason to apply it to anything before. She wanted to ask what he meant by that. She didn't. I'll write to Burris tonight, she said. And the Clements. The letters went out Friday with Duro, and the responses came back faster than Lenora expected. Burris wrote out himself on Saturday morning, which she took as a measure of how seriously he was taking it. He sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee going warm in front of him and listened to the whole thing: the water rights dispute, Holt's corrective filing, Crane's visits, the informer and her own crew. When she finished, he sat quietly for a moment. The Clement boundary situation, he said. What they didn't know, what I'd bet they still don't know, is that the grazing agreement Sutter used to take that pasture in '82 had the same kind of procedural gap as your water filing. Lenora stared at him. How do you know that? Because I was there when the Clements signed it. I saw the document. There was no county recorder's stamp. I didn't think to say anything at the time, because I didn't know what I was looking at. He looked at his coffee. I've been thinking about it ever since. Cade, who was sitting quietly near the wall, said, Sutter's been using the same method for years. It looks like it, Burris said. Find the procedural gap, or leave one in the document on purpose, and then come back years later with a challenge when the other party has stopped looking. The three of them sat with that for a moment. If the Clements' agreement has the same defect, Lenora said, and Holt can document it, then it's not an isolated case, Cade said. It's a pattern. And a territorial court takes patterns a lot more seriously than individual disputes, Burris said. He looked at Lenora. You'd need Holt involved again. Holt's already involved, she said. I'll write him today. Burris nodded and stood up. At the door he paused. My wife asked me to tell you that if you need anything practical, meals brought out, hands to borrow you say the word. Lenora felt something move in her chest that she didn't quite have words for. 18 months of doing this alone, and now, suddenly, 3 people at her table. Tell her thank you, Lenora said. After Burris left, the kitchen was quiet again, except for the wind picking up outside and the sound of Hector moving cattle somewhere below. Cade was still by the wall. You thought of this, she said. The coalition. I mentioned it, he said. You knew who to call. Don't do that, she said. He looked at her. Do what? Minimize what you contribute, and then stand over there like you're not part of this. He was quiet for a moment. I'm a hired carpenter, he said. Not defensively. More like a reminder he was giving himself. You're not, she said plainly. You haven't been that for at least 2 weeks, and we both know it. She picked up her pen to write to Holt and didn't look at him again, because she'd said the true thing and she didn't need to watch him figure out what to do with it. She could hear him after a moment push off the wall. She could hear him pick up his hat. She waited for the sound of the door. Instead, she heard him come back to the table and sit down in the chair across from her. What do you need me to do? He said. She looked up. I need you to help me draft the letter to Holt, she said. You understand the legal structure better than I do at this point, and I need it to be clear. He pulled the paper toward him. Tell me what you want to say, he said, and I'll help you say it right. They worked at the table until the afternoon light started going gray and long across the kitchen floor, and the wind outside built slowly into something that felt like a warning. And neither of them talked about anything other than the letter, because the letter was what mattered now, and everything else could wait for a time that was less complicated, if such a time ever came. The letter to Holt went out Monday morning, and the waiting began again. Lenora had gotten better at waiting. That was one of the things 18 months of fighting alone had taught her, not patience exactly, more like the discipline of staying functional while the thing you needed was out of your hands. You kept working. You fed the cattle. You checked the fence. You did the accounts. You let the waiting happen in the background, like weather you couldn't do anything about. What she hadn't gotten better at was sleeping. It was Wednesday night, 3 days after Burris's visit, and she was sitting at the kitchen table at 11:30, with the lamp turned low and a cup of tea she didn't want, going over the property tax records she'd pulled from Edmund's files that afternoon. She was looking for the kind of procedural gap that Holt had found in the water rights, anything that Sutter's people might use as a second angle if the water rights challenge failed. Edmund had been a decent man. He had not been a meticulous one. What she found in the tax records wasn't alarming exactly, but it wasn't clean either. There was a 2-year stretch in the early 1880s where the property tax payments had been made, but the receipts hadn't been properly filed with the county. The payments had cleared, she could see the bank records, but without the county receipt copies, there was a gap in the documented chain that a creative attorney could theoretically use to raise questions about continuous ownership. It was thin, but thin had been enough before. She was still staring at the records when she heard boots on the porch. A soft knock. She pulled her shawl tighter and went to the door. Cade was standing on the porch with his jacket on and his hair still damp from the creek, which meant he'd been washing up late after working past dark again. "Saw the lamp," he said. "Figured you weren't sleeping." "I wasn't," she said. She stepped back to let him in. He came inside and looked at the documents spread across the table. More problems, possibly. She told him what she'd found, the tax receipt gap, what it might mean if Sutter's attorneys were looking for secondary angles. He listened, standing up, looking at the records without touching them, his jaw working slightly in the way it did when he was processing something. "Does Holt know about this?" Cade asked. "I haven't told him yet. The letter I sent Monday was already long. Write him a postscript tonight. Don't wait." She looked at him. "It might be nothing. It also might be the next thing Crane walks in here with." His voice was flat, not unkind, just direct. "You've been running a step behind Sutter this whole time. Every time you think you've closed one hole, there's another. That means he has a list and he's working through it." She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. "Sit down," she said. "Help me write it." He sat. They wrote. It was past midnight when they finished, and she sealed the envelope and put it on the table by the door to go out with the morning stage. The lamp was burning low. The wind had come up outside, pushing against the windows with the particular insistence of a front moving in from the north. "Another storm," she said, looking at the window. "Weather's been building all week," he said. "The temperature dropped 8 degrees today." She looked at him across the table. His face in the low lamplight was tired in a way she hadn't noticed until just now. Not the tiredness of one late night, but the accumulated tiredness of weeks of hard work and late hours and carrying something he hadn't said out loud. "You should sleep," she said. "So should you. I will." She paused. "Thank you for coming over." He started to say something, she could see it forming, something that would reduce what had just happened to something practical, and then he didn't. Instead, he picked up his hat, said goodnight, and went out into the rising wind. She sat there alone for another few minutes, listening to the wind build. She went to bed. She didn't sleep well. Holt's reply came Thursday afternoon. It was longer than she expected and more urgent than she was prepared for. He wrote that the tax receipt gap was exactly the kind of secondary challenge he'd been afraid of, not fatal on its own, but dangerous if combined with anything else. More importantly, he had learned through a contact in Helena that Sutter's attorneys had filed a formal challenge to the water rights correction the previous Friday. Not an inquiry this time, a formal filing. The corrective affidavit was now being contested. There would be a territorial hearing. The date hadn't been set, but Holt estimated 4 to 6 weeks. He needed 3 things from Lenora immediately: the bank records documenting the tax payments from the gap years, a signed letter from any county official who could attest to continuous property ownership, and any correspondence or documentation touching the water rights from before Edmund's filing, anything that showed the intent and use of the right before the formal recording. He signed off with 3 words that Lenora read twice: "Do not stall." She went and found Cade in the barn. She handed him the letter without saying anything. He read it standing up, then read it again. 4 to 6 weeks, he said. Yes. Can you get the bank records? Edmund kept most of the financial records in a trunk in the spare room. I haven't gone through all of it. She paused. I've been avoiding it, honestly. Cade looked at her. Because of him? Because of all of it. She took the letter back. He kept everything. Receipts, correspondence, old bills. I didn't know at the time that someday I'd need every scrap of paper he ever touched. Then we go through the trunk today, Cade said. Right now if you can. You don't have to help with that, she said. It's personal. I know. He looked at her steadily. Do you want help or not? She held his gaze for a moment. Yes, she said. The trunk was in the spare room where Holt had slept, pushed against the wall under the window. It was a large wooden trunk with brass fittings that had come with Edmund from Ohio, one of the few things he'd brought from before. Lenora hadn't opened it in over a year. She opened it now. It smelled like Edmund paper and cedar, and the faint trace of the pipe tobacco he'd mostly given up by the time they married. She stood over it for a moment longer than was useful, just breathing, then began pulling documents out and sorting them by year. Cade sorted silently beside her, making 3 piles: financial records, property correspondence, everything else without being told to. He had a quiet efficiency with physical tasks that Lenora had noticed early on and had never quite gotten used to. He didn't fill space with talk when work was available. They went through the trunk for 2 hours. The bank records were there, all of them, going back to 1879. Edmund had been better at keeping financial documents than at filing them anywhere useful. The relevant gap years were 1881 and 1882, and the payment records were clear and dated and carried the bank stamp on each one. That's what Holt needs, Cade said, looking at the stack. Yes. Lenora was holding a different document, a letter, handwritten on county stationery, dated 1879, from the previous county recorder, acknowledging Edmund's purchase and recording the water right and formally before the formal filing the following year. And this might be what he needs even more. Cade looked at it. Pre-filing acknowledgement. Written evidence that the water usage was recognized before the formal filing. If Sutter's argument is about the filing's technical defects, this shows the underlying right existed and was acknowledged before any of those technicalities. She was reading it carefully. Holt will know what to do with it. She set it carefully on the stack of financial records. At the bottom of the trunk, under a layer of papers she'd have to go through separately, was Edmund's journal. She hadn't known he kept one. She picked it up and set it on the floor beside the trunk without opening it. Cade noticed but didn't say anything. She packaged up the bank records and the 1879 letter that afternoon and sent Duro to town with them on the last stage of the day, with a note for Holt explaining what she'd found and where it fit. Then she sat in the kitchen with the journal on the table in front of her for a long time. She opened it eventually. The last entry was 3 weeks before Edmund died, written in the increasingly difficult handwriting of a man who'd been sick for 2 weeks and was only beginning to admit it. He wrote about the cattle numbers for spring, and a fence repair he'd been meaning to make, and a note that Hector had found a section of the north pasture where the grass wasn't coming back the way it should. Practical things. Ranch things. The second to last line said, Lenora handles more than she should have to. She never says anything about it. I think she believes I don't notice. I notice. She closed the journal. She put it back in the trunk and closed the lid. She sat for a while with the closed trunk in front of her in the quiet spare room, with the evening light going flat against the window. Edmund had noticed. She was glad she knew that, even this late. The next week ran hard. Holt wired from Billings that the bank records and the 1879 letter were exactly what he needed, and that he believed they substantially strengthened the case for the hearing. He had found a territorial court judge with jurisdiction over the cone, methodical fairness, not sympathetic to large landowners, particularly not hostile either, just rigorous. Holt considered that a good draw. Sutter's attorneys would have preferred someone who moved faster and asked fewer questions. The hearing date was set, 6 weeks out, the 3rd week of August. 6 weeks was both enough time and not enough. Lenora sent letters to the Clements and to 2 other families Burris had mentioned, the Garcias, whose eastern pasture bordered Sutter's expansion, and a widow named Verna Hassett, who ran a small horse operation north of town and had been fighting a grazing dispute with Sutter for 3 years without legal support. She invited them all to a meeting at the Whitlock Ranch the following Saturday. She kept the invitation practical. This isn't a complaint session. She wrote, it's a strategy conversation. Holt had agreed to attend by letter, at least, sending prepared notes on each family's situation, which she would present. All 4 families said yes. Saturday brought 6 people to her kitchen table: Burris, the Clements, the elder Garcia and his son, and Verna Hassett, who was a small, straight-backed woman in her 60s who looked like she'd been arguing with difficult men her entire life and had gotten better at it every year. Hector sat in the corner by the stove. Cade sat near the door, which was his habit, close enough to contribute, far enough to make clear he wasn't claiming space he hadn't been given. Lenora had organized Holt's note the night before and spent an hour deciding how to open the meeting. She didn't want it to feel like a legal lecture. She didn't want it to feel like desperation either. She opened it plainly. Sutter has been using procedural gaps in property documentation to isolate and pressure landowners in this county for at least 15 years, she said. He plants the gaps when he can, and when he can't plant them, he finds the ones that already exist. He has resources to sustain long disputes that most of us individually don't. But he has been operating on the assumption that none of us are talking to each other. She let that sit for a moment. We're talking to each other now. What came out of the next 3 hours was messy and sometimes painful, and occasionally heated. Garcia's son had strong opinions about what action should be taken that his father kept moderating, and Verna Hassett's account of her 3-year grazing dispute was detailed enough that it pushed the conversation sideways for 20 minutes before Lenora steered it back. But underneath the messiness, something was building. They had 6 properties, 6 documented situations. 2 of them Lenora's water rights, and what Burris remembered about the Clement grazing agreement had enough overlap in method to constitute a pattern in legal terms. Holt had written specifically about this. Pattern evidence could be introduced at a territorial hearing as context for systematic conduct, which was different from and more damaging than a single property dispute. By late afternoon, they had agreed on 4 things: to share all relevant documentation with Holt through Lenora as the central contact, to say nothing publicly about the coalition until after the August hearing, to organize a collective account of Sutter's documented actions for Holt to assess, and to ask Ada Frisch quietly whether the county recorder's records showed any other suspicious patterns in Sutter's historical filings. After everyone left, Lenora stood in her yard in the long early evening light and felt, for the first time in weeks, like she was standing on solid ground rather than defending it. Cade came up beside her. That was well done, he said. It was a start, she said. It was more than a start. He looked at the empty drive where the last of the wagons had disappeared. Verna Hassett is going to be a problem in the best possible way. Lenora almost smiled. Verna Hassett had left the meeting with Holt's contact information and the look of a woman who intended to make full use of it. She has more documentation than any of the others. 3 years of fighting means 3 years of records. Exactly. They stood for a moment in the quiet of the yard. August is 6 weeks, she said. 5.5 now. She nodded. There was still so much that could go wrong between now and then. Sutter hadn't played his last card, she was certain of that. But for the first time, she felt like she was playing the game rather than just surviving it. The storm came 8 days before the hearing. It announced itself the way the worst ones always did, not loudly, but with an ominous quiet that settled over the mountains the day before. A drop in temperature that had the cattle moving towards shelter without being driven. A change in the air that Hector identified with the certainty of a man who'd been reading Montana weather for 30 years. Bad one, he said simply, when Lenora came out of the barn that morning. How bad? He looked at the sky to the northwest. Bad. By mid-afternoon, the clouds had come down to the peaks, and the wind had started its preliminary work, the kind of gusting that precedes the real thing by hours. Cade spent the day reinforcing everything he'd reinforced before: the barn doors, the corral gates, the repaired section of the farmhouse roof, going through each one methodically and checking what he'd done against what the storm was going to try to undo. Lenora was moving cattle with Hector and Duro, getting the vulnerable animals into the south pasture and the barn, when Cade found her at the corral gate at around 4 in the afternoon. His face was tight with something she hadn't seen there before. The upstream diversion gate, he said. She stopped. What about it? I rode up to check it an hour ago. It's been moved. He met her eyes. Someone opened it, partway. If that stays open through a heavy rain, you'll get significant flooding in the lower pasture. The creek will run over its banks. Lenora stared at him. The gate was closed yesterday morning. I checked it myself. I know. His jaw was set. This wasn't the storm. Somebody went up there and opened it. She thought of Crane. She thought of the timing 8 days before the hearing, while the coalition's documentation was making its way to Holt, while the pressure was building. She thought of Cal Burris saying, Sutter doesn't like losing. He looks for another angle. We have to close it, she said, already moving toward the horses. Lenora. He caught her arm, not hard, just enough to make her stop. The water's already moving. If the storm hits full force before we get up there, that's a bad ride. I know, she said. That's why we go now. He looked at her for a moment. I'll go with you. You're needed on the barn. Hector and Duro can handle the barn. He was already turning toward the horses. You're not riding up to a flooding diversion gate alone. She didn't argue. They rode hard up the creek line, the wind coming at them in gusts strong enough to push the horses sideways on the open sections. The creek was already running higher than normal, fed by whatever rain had already fallen in the upper elevations, and the sound of it carried over the wind in a way that made Lenora's chest tight. The diversion gate was a timber and iron structure set into the creek bank above the property's lower pasture built years ago to control overflow in heavy rain years, operated by a wheel mechanism that took some effort to turn. Someone had turned it perhaps a quarter open, not enough to look obviously tampered with, enough to cause serious damage through a storm night. Cade was off his horse before it had fully stopped. He waded into the creek to his knees, which was cold enough to make him inhale sharply, and got both hands on the wheel mechanism. It was stiff, partially seized from disuse, and the current pushed against it. He got it moving on the third hard effort, turning it back toward closed while the water pushed around his legs, and Lenora held both horses on the bank and watched the sky and the rising creek and the tree line for any movement that wasn't wind. She saw movement. It was downstream, near the lower bend where the creek turned before the property boundary. A rider, moving fast, going away from them. She couldn't see who it was from this distance, but the direction and the speed told her everything. Cade, she said. Almost got it, he said through his teeth, still working the wheel. Someone just left downstream. He got the gate closed, pulled himself out of the creek, and looked where she was pointing. But the rider was gone into the tree line. Did you see his face? He asked. No, he was moving too fast. She handed him his horse's reins. He was Sutter's. You don't know that for certain. I know, she said. He didn't argue with her certainty, because he'd been around her long enough to know the difference between her guessing and her knowing. They rode back down to the ranch at a controlled pace, the storm pressing down harder now, the first real rain beginning not yet heavy but purposeful, the leading edge of what was coming. By the time they reached the yard, the light was gray-green, and the wind had a voice in it, and the farmhouse and barn looked smaller than usual against the scale of what was building to the northwest. Hector was at the barn doors. He took one look at Cade's wet legs and Lenora's face and said nothing, which was the appropriate response. We need everyone inside in an hour, Lenora said. Whatever's not done doesn't get done in this storm. Hector nodded and went. The storm hit fully at 9 o'clock that night. It came in 3 waves, the first being rain heavy enough to make the roof sound like it was under sustained rifle fire. The second being wind that had enough force behind it to make the reinforced barn doors shudder in their frames. And the third, the worst, arriving around midnight, a combination of both that made the entire structure of the farmhouse creak and settle and adjust in ways that would have terrified Lenora before Cade had gone over every board. She wasn't terrified now. She was listening. She was listening to the barn, which was holding. She was listening to the roof, which was also holding. She could feel the difference between Cade's rebuilt section and the older sections around it. The way the rebuilt portion stayed still while the rest of the house made its normal storm sounds. She was listening to the creek, which she could hear even over the rain, running loud and fast below the lower pasture. Cade was in the barn. He'd gone out at 10 to check on the animals during the first wave, and hadn't come back in, which meant something had needed fixing. She knew he wouldn't come in until it was handled. She tried not to think about the barn roof, which she knew was not as solid as the farmhouse roof, which was the reason he'd spent the last 3 weeks reinforcing the upper wall boards. At midnight, the wind reached something she had no scale, for she'd lived through bad storms in Montana, but this one had a different quality, a sustained howl that changed pitch rather than ebbing and surging. The lamp swung on its hook. The windows flexed. She stood in the kitchen with her coat on, hat on, ready to go out if she needed to. Then she heard it. Not a crash. More like a progressive tearing sound, something large giving way in stages rather than all at once. And then a sound like thunder that was coming from the wrong direction, from inside the property rather than the sky. She was out the door before she'd made a conscious decision to move. The barn's east section roof had partially come down. She could see it in the dim light from the farmhouse windows, and the lightning that was now coming in sheets from the north, a section of the upper roof had given at the ridge joint. The part she knew Cade had identified as a concern but hadn't fully addressed because there hadn't been enough time. It had peeled back rather than fallen straight, one corner lifting and the other pulling down. And through the gap she could hear the panic sound of horses and the lower frightened noise of cattle. And no sign of Cade. Cade, she called. The wind took it. She ran to the barn. The main door was still closed and latched. She threw the latch and pulled it, and the wind tried to rip it from her hands, and she used both arms to hold it and get inside. The interior was chaos. The horses in the east stalls were terrified, pulling at their tie ropes, eyes showing white. 2 of the cattle had gotten through a gap in the stall boards and were loose in the central aisle. Above the east section, the broken roof was letting in rain and wind in a way that made the whole east side of the barn feel open to the sky. And Cade was up in the loft. She could see him above the east stalls. He'd climbed up into the damaged section and was to free a rafter that had come down and was pressing against one of the tie beams, preventing the rope from one of the horse's ties from releasing. The horse was pulling against the rope from below. And if the rafter shifted wrong, the whole arrangement was going to become dangerous in a way that could kill the horse and anyone in its path. "Cade, get down from there," she shouted. "The rafter's caught," he shouted back. "I can free it if you can get the horse moved first." She didn't hesitate. She went into the east stall beside the panicked horse. This was Hector's mare. A brown animal with no small opinion of itself under normal circumstances, and currently operating on pure fear, and she got both hands on the animal's halter, and her voice close to the horse's head, low and continuous, the same nonsense words she'd used since she was 12 years old. Because horses didn't care about content. They cared about frequency and steadiness, and she pulled the animal toward her rather than fighting its panic, letting it move the direction it wanted while she redirected the angle. "Now," she called. She heard the rafter move above her. The tension in the tie rope shifted. The horse lurched forward into her. She took the full weight of 1,000 pounds of terrified animal against her chest and shoulder and went sideways into the stall wall. It knocked the breath out of her completely. She held on. The horse righted itself, and she hung onto the halter, gasping, and the rope was free, and she was still standing, even though her right shoulder felt like it had been used as a fence post. She got the horse out of the stall and into the main aisle and looked up. Cade was gone from where he'd been. She could hear him on the other side of the loft, moving toward the ladder, she thought. Then she heard a different sound. Another tearing from above, and the section of roof that had been partially down shifted again, dropping another 18 inches on the east side, and something heavy came down through the gap. The sound was wrong, a sound you felt more than heard. Then silence from above where Cade had been. She screamed his name. Nothing for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. Then his voice. Below where she expected it, he'd come down the ladder already, and she couldn't see him in the dark and chaos of the main aisle. "I'm here," he said. "I'm here." She found him in the aisle between 2 stalls, sitting on the floor with his back against the boards, a hand pressed to his left side. His face was gray-white in the dim light. "What happened?" she said, already crouching beside him. "Part of the loft decking came down," he said. His voice was controlled, but she could hear the effort in it. "Caught me on the side going down. I'm all right." "You don't look all right." "I'm functional," he said, which was a different thing from all right, and they both knew it. She got her shoulder under his arm and helped him up, and he came up without arguing, which was how she knew the pain was real. She got him to the main barn door, got it open against the wind, and they went across the yard in the rain together. Inside the farmhouse, she got him onto the kitchen bench and pulled back his shirt to look at his side, which he permitted with the stiff tolerance of a man who was not accustomed to being attended to. The skin over his lower left ribs was already with bruising, and there was a cut along the bottom of his rib cage that had bled considerably into his shirt, but had slowed. "Breathe for me," she said. He breathed. She watched his rib cage. He winced, but the expansion was even. "Probably not broken," she said. "But that's a serious bruise. You might have cracked one." "I've cracked ribs before," he said. I can tell the difference. And? And I don't know, he admitted. Maybe. She cleaned the cut and bandaged it with the clean linen she kept in the kitchen cabinet, working efficiently, not talking more than necessary, because talking required looking at his face, and his face was too close and too unguarded right now. Pain stripped away the careful quiet he usually wore and left something underneath that she wasn't sure either of them was ready for. The animals, he said, while she worked. Hector will get them sorted, she said. The main part of the barn is holding. The horses are loose in the aisle, but they'll settle. The rafter, I heard it come down. It didn't hit anything critical. She tied off the bandage. Be still. He was quiet. Outside, the storm was still going, though it felt like the worst of the wind had peaked. The rain was still heavy. She could hear the creak, which was louder than it had been earlier. The gate, she said, mostly to herself. We closed it, he said. I know. But if the rain is this heavy in the upper elevations, she stopped. If they came back and opened it again after we left, she saw it cross his face, the same thought arriving at the same moment. Neither of them said anything for a second. Then she was standing up, reaching for her coat. You are not riding back up there tonight, Cade said. His voice was sharp. If the gate is open again, my lower pasture floods and I lose the fencing that Hector just finished in the spring and possibly some animals. Lenora, I'm not asking permission, Cade. She was already at the door. He tried to stand. She watched him register the pain and push through it anyway, which made her chest do something complicated. Sit down, she said. You're not going alone. You have cracked ribs. Maybe cracked, he said. And he was on his feet, coat already in hand. She looked at him for a moment. This is stupid, she said. Yes, he agreed. Let's go. They rode up the creek line in the storm a second time, slower than before because the footing was worse. The trails was running with water and the horses had to pick carefully in the dark between lightning strikes. Cade rode without making a sound, which she took as evidence that every step the horse took was sending something painful through his left side. But he kept pace, and he didn't say anything about stopping. She saw it when they were still 50 yards out, a figure at the gate. Not closing it, it was already open again, swung to nearly half but standing beside it in the rain with a horse nearby, doing something she couldn't identify in the dark. She put her horse forward before she'd thought it through. The figure heard her coming and spun. In the next lightning flash, she got a clear look, young man, 20s, hat soaked through, the Sutter brand on his horse's flank. He'd been trying to jam something into the gate mechanism. She realized something to prevent it from being closed easily again. He went for his horse. She got between him and the horse before he made it. Not because she planned to physically stop him. She wasn't carrying anything. She'd come out in too much of a hurry to think about that, but because the horse spooked sideways at her arrival, and that bought her 3 seconds. And 3 seconds was enough for Cade to come up on the other side and cut off the other direction. The young man stopped. He looked between them. He was soaked to the skin and shaking, and whether that was cold or fear or both she couldn't tell. Get off that horse's reins, he said to Lenora, trying for a voice that had authority and not quite managing it. I'm not holding his reins, she said. He spooked on his own. She looked at the man. She'd seen him once before she couldn't place where. What's your name? What is your name? She said again. The same tone, just steady. He was young enough and rattled enough that he answered before he thought about it. Purvis. Ray Purvis. You work for Sutter. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. Cade had come around behind him, cutting off the downstream route. His face was tight with pain, but his voice when he spoke was even. You've been up here twice tonight, Ray. We closed this gate 4 hours ago. You came back and opened it again. He paused. You want to tell me that was your own idea? Purvis said nothing. Crane sent you, Lenora said. His eyes moved, just slightly, but she saw it. You're going to come back to the ranch with us, she said. And in the morning, you're going to talk to someone. I don't have to go anywhere with you, he said. But his voice had changed younger, less certain. No, Cade said from behind him. You don't. You can ride back to Sutter's place tonight and tell Crane you got caught, and then you can see what Crane does about that. Or you can come with us, and we'll keep you out of it publicly, in exchange for what you know. Purvis turned to look at him. He won't keep you out of anything, Cade said. Not unkindly. You know that. You're the one standing in the rain with your hands in someone else's gate. He's sitting dry somewhere, and he'll deny knowing your name. A long pause. Rain coming down hard. The creek running fast and loud below them. Purvis came with them. It was nearly 3 in the morning when they got back to the ranch. Hector was in the barn with the animals and came out when he heard the horses. He took one look at Cade, at Purvis, and at Lenora's face and organized everything without being asked. Took Purvis to the bunkhouse with the clear, wordless authority of a man who has been handling complicated situations for 30 years, told Duro to make coffee and stay awake, and went back to the barn. Lenora stood in the yard in the rain for a moment after everyone else had gone inside. The storm was passing. She could feel it. The wind had changed direction slightly, which meant the center of it had gone through, and what was left was the trailing edge rather than the force of it. The rain was still heavy, but the quality of it was different. The worst was behind them. She looked at the barn. The east section roof had lost a significant portion. There would be work to do in the morning that she couldn't yet estimate. The lower pasture had taken some water she could see, in the lightning flashes, that the ground below was wet enough to reflect light, though the cattle were still on their feet. Cade came up beside her. He was standing carefully, not holding his side but not quite breathing normally. "Go inside," she said. "In a minute." They stood there together in the trailing rain, looking at what the storm had done and what it hadn't. "Tomorrow," she said, "Purvis talks, and then we get everything to halt." "Yes," Cade said. She turned to look at him. In the gray pre-dawn light, with the rain still coming down, and his face drawn with pain and exhaustion, he looked like someone who had been through something true rather than something managed. Not heroic, just real. "You didn't have to come back up that creek with me tonight," she said. "I know," he said. "You'll be fine." He paused. "Probably." She looked at him for another moment. "Inside," she said. "I'll look at the bandage again." He followed her in. The lamp was still burning in the kitchen, burning steady, the way it had been burning every night since Cade Holloway had first ridden up her drive and told her the truth about a rotting beam. And the two of them sat at the kitchen table in the remains of the night, while the storm finished passing and the creek ran high outside. And somewhere in the bunkhouse, a young man named Ray Purvis sat with a cup of coffee and thought about what he was going to say in the morning. Ray Purvis started talking at 7 in the morning. He'd slept 3 hours in the bunkhouse and eaten the breakfast Hector put in front of him without being asked. And somewhere between the storm and the daylight and the coffee and the fact that Cade had been right about exactly what Crane would do if he went back empty-handed, the young man had made his decision. He sat at Lenora's kitchen table with his hands around a second cup and told them what he knew. It wasn't everything. He was 23 years old and had been working Sutter's operation for 14 months, which meant he knew the shape of things without knowing all the details. But the shape was enough. Crane had sent him. Crane had told him. The gate job was routine water management, adjusting flow before the storm to protect Sutter's downstream property. Purvis had known that was a lie by the second time he'd done it, which was last night. But by then he was in it deep enough that getting out felt more dangerous than staying. He named 2 other hands who had done similar jobs on similar nights, not at Lenora's property, but at 2 others. He didn't know all the properties. He knew the pattern. Lenora wrote everything down. She wrote it in the careful, precise handwriting she used for legal documents. Not because she'd been told to, but because she understood instinctively that this was the kind of account that needed to be in writing immediately, before memory softened edges and lawyers started questioning sequencing. She wrote the date, the time, Purvis's full name, and then what he said in the order he said it, pausing occasionally to ask him to repeat something or clarify a detail. Cade sat across the table and didn't speak much. His left side was badly bruised and he was moving carefully, the particular economy of motion that injured people develop when every unnecessary action costs them something. He'd let Lenora look at the bandage again that morning and hadn't argued when she said she thought one of the lower ribs was probably cracked. He just nodded and adjusted how he sat and kept going. When Purvis finished, Lenora put down her pen and looked at him. "You understand that if this goes to the hearing, they may ask you to testify," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Crane will know it was me." "Yes," and Sutter. "Yes." He looked at the table. He was young enough that this was still a genuinely hard calculation, old enough to understand what was at stake. "What happens to me if I do?" "I don't know exactly," Lenora said. "I won't make you a promise I can't keep." She paused. "What I can tell you is that my attorney will know you cooperated, and that Sutter's ability to make your life difficult depends on his continued power in this county, which is exactly what we're working to end." He looked at Cade. Cade said, "You came back to that gate twice in a storm. That's already done. The question now is whether you get in front of it or let it catch you from behind. A long pause. All right, Purvis said. What do you need me to do? Duro rode to town with 2 items, a signed statement from Purvis, witnessed by Lenora and Cade and Hector, and a wire to Holt that was the longest telegram Lenora had ever sent. She used short words and packed in everything the gate sabotage, the 2 attempts in one night, Purvis's statement, his willingness to potentially testify, Crane's involvement, and the pattern of similar actions at other properties. She ended the wire with 4 words. How does this change things? Holt's reply came back 6 hours later. Changes everything, stop. This is criminal conduct, not civil, stop. Recommend filing with territorial marshal. In addition to hearing evidence, stop. Preserve all documentation, stop. Do not let Purvis leave, stop. Arriving Friday, stop. Holt. She read it to Cade, standing in the yard, while Hector worked on the east section of the barn roof behind them, patching what could be patched with the lumber they had on hand. The damage was substantial. The whole east corner section would need rebuilding, which was weeks of work. But the animals were all right, and the barn was functional. That was what mattered today. Cade listened to the wire and was quiet for a moment. Criminal conduct, he said. Deliberately sabotaging water access to a property during a storm, Lenora said. If the gate had stayed open and the lower pasture had flooded badly enough, I could have lost animals. I could have lost fencing that would have taken months to replace. She folded the wire. He wasn't just trying to devalue the property for a sale. He was trying to cause real damage. That's a different category of trouble for Sutter, Cade said. Yes, she looked at the wire in her hands. Holt says the territorial marshal, which means this could become a criminal case alongside the civil hearing, which means Sutter has a lot more to lose now than he did a week ago. The understanding settled between them, not satisfaction exactly, more the particular gravity that comes when a situation shifts from difficult to genuinely dangerous, and you're on the right side of it. Hector approached that evening with the careful expression he reserved for things he'd been sitting on for a while. He waited until after supper, when Duro had gone to the bunkhouse and Purvis was somewhere in the middle of a long, quiet day of just staying put, and found Lenora in the yard checking the repaired windmill. Something I should tell you, he said. She looked at him. Crane was in town this afternoon. A boy I know saw him at the telegraph office. Hector kept his eyes on the middle distance. Half-hour after Duro came through with your wire to Holt. The implication was immediate and cold. Someone at the telegraph office told him, she said. Can't prove it. But the timing is what it is. She thought about this. Sutter had eyes at the land office, potentially at the telegraph office, and had managed to get a man inside her own crew. The web was wider than she'd mapped. Does Crane know what was in the wire? Don't know. Operators aren't supposed to repeat content. But Sutter knows people, she said. Yes. She stood with this for a moment. If Crane knew they had Purvis's statement, if Crane knew Holt was coming Friday, if Crane knew the word criminal had been used, Sutter would begin calculating his exposure. And men who calculated their exposure early sometimes did things to change the arithmetic. Is Purvis safe in the bunkhouse, she said. Hector considered. For now. Crane doesn't have cause to come onto this property. He came through that front door once before without cause. Hector nodded slowly. I'll sleep in the bunkhouse tonight. Take Duro, too. He nodded again and left. Cade had come out of the barn during this exchange and stood a few feet away, close enough to hear. When Hector left, he looked at Lenora. You think Sutter will move against Purvis, he said. I think Sutter is about to realize that Purvis is the only person who can put Crane at that gate with direct knowledge. She paused. And I think men who've been operating the way Sutter operates don't respond well to that kind of vulnerability. Should we move him somewhere? She thought about it. Moving him tonight draws attention. And where would we move him? Burris's property, maybe. But if Crane's already watching the roads, she stopped. No, we keep him here. We keep people around him, and we get Holt here as fast as possible. Holt said Friday. Holt said he's arriving Friday. I need him here Thursday. She went back inside and wrote another wire. She sent Hector with it personally, on horseback, rather than through Duro, with instructions to take the long route past the Garcia property and hand it directly to the operator at the relay station 6 miles east, not the Briar Mesa office. Hector left before dawn Thursday morning and was back by noon with Holt's reply. He would be on the Wednesday night stage rather than Thursday's, arriving in Briar Mesa Thursday morning. 1 day sooner. It was something. She spent Wednesday going through the documents she hadn't fully organized the Clement grazing agreement records that Burris had described, Verna Hassett's 3 years of dispute correspondence, the Garcia family's eastern boundary paperwork. She laid them out in sequence on the kitchen table, not looking for anything specific, but letting the pattern emerge the way Holt had taught her to look at her own documents, not as individual items, but as a sequence, a story told through paper. The story told through paper was consistent and damning. The procedural gaps weren't random. In 3 of the 6 cases she had documentation for, the gap was in the same place the county recorder's acknowledgement step. Not the filing itself, which was harder to manipulate, but the acknowledgement, which was handled by a different clerk and recorded in a different ledger. Someone who knew how the recording process worked from the inside could create that gap without touching the filing. Someone with a contact at the recorder's office. She thought about Ada Frisch, saying Crane was in here 2 weeks ago, asking about your property. She thought about Ada saying she'd been there 8 years. Ada had been there 8 years. Whatever contact Sutter had in that office predated Ada, which meant it was either someone who was no longer there or someone Ada had never identified. She wrote this down and underlined it twice. Cade came in from the barn around mid-afternoon, moving more freely than yesterday. Either the rib was better, or he'd made peace with the pain, which with Cade could be either. He looked at the documents, spread across the table, and came to stand beside her, reading what she'd laid out. Same gap, he said, 3 times, same location in the process. Same clerk's signature missing. She pointed to the relevant section in each document. This isn't coincidence, and it isn't incompetence. Someone inside the recording process. Someone who knew which step to skip and was positioned to do it without leaving their own name on the irregularity. Cade straightened. Do you know who it was? I know it wasn't Ada. I think it was her predecessor, a man named Tolliver, who held the deputy recorder position before her and left in 1883 under circumstances I don't know yet. She paused. But Tolliver is gone. So what Holt needs isn't Tolliver, it's the pattern itself. The pattern shows systematic manipulation, and that goes to intent. Sutter's intent. Sutter's pattern of conduct. She organized the documents back into their sequence, which is what makes the difference between a property dispute and something a territorial court takes seriously as a matter of public concern. Cade was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You've gotten good at this." She looked at him. "The legal thinking," he said. 2 months ago, you were looking at your own filing and saying, may be wrong versus provably wrong. Now you're mapping systemic conduct and identifying evidentiary patterns." She considered this. "I've had a good teacher, Holt," he said. "Among others," she said, and went back to her documents. She didn't look up, but she heard him go still for a moment before he moved to the far side of the table and sat down. Holt arrived Thursday morning on the early stage, looking like a man who had slept badly on a moving coach and intended to work anyway. He shook Lenora's hand at the door, nodded at Cade, and asked to see Purvis before he took his coat off. He talked to Purvis for 45 minutes in the spare room with the door closed. Lenora stayed in the kitchen. Cade stayed in the kitchen. Neither of them talked much. When Holt came out, his expression had shifted into something harder and more certain than she'd seen from him before. "His account is credible and specific," Holt said, sitting down at the table. "He has names, dates, and enough detail about Crane's instructions to constitute a direct evidentiary link between the gate sabotage and Sutter's operation." He set down his leather case. "This is not just supporting evidence for the hearing. This is the basis for a criminal complaint to the territorial marshal, which changes the calculus for Sutter," Lenora said. "Substantially. A civil property hearing costs him money and reputation. A criminal investigation involving deliberate sabotage of water access in a territory where water disputes have turned violent, before that's a different kind of exposure." Holt opened his case. "I've taken the liberty of drafting a preliminary complaint. I'd like to file it in Briar Mesa today, before the hearing date." "Today," Cade said. "This afternoon. I don't want to give his attorneys another day to build a counter-narrative around Purvis's credibility." He looked at Lenora. "How he's been treated since last night will matter. I want to be able to say he came forward voluntarily, was treated fairly, and gave his statement without inducement." "He was given breakfast and a bunk," Lenora said. "Nothing else." "Good." Holt began organizing his papers. "I also want to discuss the pattern evidence you mentioned in your wire. The 3 properties with the same recorder gap." She pulled the documents toward him and showed him what she'd found. He read in silence for 12 minutes. When he looked up, his face had the particular expression of an attorney encountering something that reorganizes the shape of a case in a way that is simultaneously useful and sobering. If this holds, if the Clement and Hassett documentation corroborates the pattern, this stops being a single county dispute. He looked at Lenora. This becomes a territorial matter. I know, she said. Which is good for you and very bad for Sutter. I know that too. Holt filed the criminal complaint that afternoon with the Briar Mesa deputy marshal, a straightforward man named Aldrich, who read it twice and asked 3 questions and said he'd be contacting Helena for authorization to investigate. He didn't seem surprised, which Lenora found interesting, and asked Holt about afterward. Aldrich has had Sutter complaints before, Holt said. Nothing that rose to this level. He's been waiting for something with teeth, and now he has it. He has the beginning of it. We need corroboration from at least one more source, either another witness to the gate action, or documentary evidence connecting Crane's instructions to Sutter directly. He looked at her. Did Purvis say anything about written instructions? Crane gave him instructions verbally. Always verbally. Of course. Holt was quiet for a moment. What about Crane's employment records? Does Sutter keep books on his ranch operation? Payroll, duty assignments? I don't have access to Sutter's books. No. But if Crane is on payroll as ranch foreman and his duties include what Purvis described, those records might exist. He looked at Cade. Is there anyone inside Sutter's operation who would have knowledge of how Crane's duties are recorded? Cade thought about it. I worked the regional circuit for years. I know some of the men who've passed through Sutter's crew. He paused. There's a man named Teller who worked Sutter's property for 3 seasons before moving to the Clement spread. He might know how Crane's assignments were handled. Holt looked at Lenora. Find Teller, she said. Cade left that afternoon. He came back the following morning with Teller in tow, a compact, weathered man in his 50s who looked like he'd spent his entire life outdoors and had strong feelings about certain employers that he'd been keeping to himself for approximately 3 seasons. He didn't need much convincing. What he needed was someone to tell him his account would be taken seriously rather than dismissed as a disgruntled former hand. Holt took his account seriously for 2 hours. What Teller knew was that Crane kept a personal duty ledger, separate from Sutter's official ranch books in which he recorded assignments given to temporary and seasonal hands. Crane's reasoning, as Teller understood it, was self-protection. If a job went wrong, Crane wanted a record showing who had actually done it. The ledger wasn't Sutter's, it was Crane's, which meant it was Crane's liability, sitting somewhere on Sutter's property, and Crane probably didn't realize how useful it was going to be for the other side. Holt wrote for a long time after Teller left. That evening he sat with Lenora and Cade at the kitchen table and laid out what he had: Purvis's statement, Teller's testimony about the ledger, the pattern evidence from the 3 properties, Ada Frisch's willingness to testify about the recorder's gap, and the corrective water rights filing that was already on record in Helena. On the civil side, he was confident. On the criminal side, the ledger was the key piece, and the ledger was on property they couldn't access. Marshal Aldrich can request it, Holt said. If Helena authorizes the investigation, he can ask Sutter to produce Crane's records. Sutter will refuse, Lenora said. His first response will be refusal, yes. But refusal creates its own record. Holt looked at the table. A man who refuses to produce documents that he claims don't implicate him is telling the investigating authority something important. Will Helena authorize fast enough? Cade asked. That depends on what Sutter does in the next week, Holt said. If he stays quiet, it may take longer than I'd like. If he applies pressure to block the authorizations, then he makes noise, Cade said, and noise draws attention. Exactly. Holt folded his hands on the table. Right now, Sutter's best move is to quietly withdraw his water rights challenge and hope the criminal matter gets buried in bureaucracy before it reaches a level where he can't contain it. Will he do that? Lenora asked. Holt paused. That depends on whether he's more afraid of losing the water rights dispute or more afraid of what Crane's ledger contains. Nobody said anything for a moment. He'll try to get the ledger first, Cade said, before Aldrich can request it. The room went quiet. Lenora saw it too, the same sequence, the same logic. If Crane kept a ledger and Sutter now knew that Purvis had talked, the first thing Sutter would do was protect himself. Not by destroying evidence. Necessarily a man careful enough to have operated this way for 15 years wouldn't be clumsy about it, but by making the ledger inaccessible, moving it, having Crane claim it didn't exist. How fast can Aldrich move, she said. I'll go to him tonight, Holt said, already standing. Aldrich moved faster than anyone expected. He sent a wire to Helena at 9 that evening, citing urgency based on the existing criminal complaint and the new testimony about documentary evidence at risk of being disposed of. Helena's response came back the following morning. Preliminary authorization granted. Formal order to follow. Aldrich empowered to request production of relevant records immediately. Aldrich rode to Sutter's property that morning with 2 deputies. The town knew about it by noon. In Briar Mesa, which was not a large town, a deputy marshal riding to Bramwell Sutter's ranch with paperwork was the kind of event that people discussed on front porches before he'd made it back. Lenora heard about it from Burris, who came by early afternoon with the look of a man who couldn't quite believe what he was watching happen. Aldrich went out there, Burris said. I know, she said. Sutter met him at the gate. Burris sat down heavily at the kitchen table. Politely. Told him Crane was unavailable and that any records request would need to go through his attorneys. That's what we expected, Holt said from across the table. What we didn't expect was what happened after. Burris looked at Lenora. Crane left the property this afternoon. One of the Garcia boys was riding past and saw him go pack a bedroll, heading north. The room processed this. He's running, Cade said. Looks that way. Burris's expression was grim, which means either the ledger goes with him or Sutter already has it. Holt was already writing. If Crane has fled the jurisdiction with evidence relevant to an active investigation, that's obstruction. That changes what Aldrich can do. Can Aldrich get ahead of him? Lenora asked. If he moves in the next 2 hours. Holt looked up. He needs to know right now. Cade was already at the door. He rode to town and back in under an hour and a half, which on a recovering cracked rib was something Lenora privately catalogued as evidence of a kind of stubbornness she found simultaneously exasperating and reassuring. He'd found Aldrich, told him about Crane, and Aldrich had sent a rider north on the main road and another on the creek trail, which were the 2 routes out of the county heading in that direction. They didn't catch Crane that night, but the following morning, a rancher 12 miles north of Briar Mesa sent word that a man matching Crane's description had stopped at his property asking about road conditions east toward the Billings Road, and had been sitting in his barn since last night, waiting out the mud from the storm. Aldrich collected him before noon. The ledger was in Crane's saddlebag. Holt told Lenora this over supper that evening, Thursday, 8 days after the storm, 6 days before the hearing, with the particular measured restraint of a man who wanted to say something definitive and knew he shouldn't yet. The ledger, she said. Aldrich has it. I've been told it contains assignment records going back 2.5 years, with enough specificity about locations, dates, and instructions to establish a documented pattern. He paused. I haven't seen it yet. I'll see it tomorrow. But, she said. But if it says what Aldrich indicated it says, Sutter's attorneys are going to have a conversation with him in the next 48 hours about what his realistic options are. The table was quiet. Hector was at the stove. Duro had gone to the bunkhouse. Purvis had moved on 2 days ago quietly, with a handshake from Lenora and a brief, awkward nod from Cade, heading toward a neighboring county in a fresh situation. It's not over, Cade said. Not until the hearing. No, Holt agreed. But the shape of it has changed considerably. The shape of it continued changing through the following week. Sutter's attorneys contacted Holt on Friday not to negotiate officially, but to request an informal conversation about the status of the water rights challenge. Holt went. He came back and told Lenora that the conversation had been professional, cautious, and had covered approximately 40 minutes of careful language that ultimately communicated one thing: their client was reassessing his position. Reassessing, Lenora said. That's the word they used 3 times, which means he's looking for a way out that doesn't look like losing. Correct. Holt set down his coffee. They asked obliquely whether your position on the original property sale offer had changed. She stared at him. I told them, Holt said, that my client's position on a sale had not changed and would not be part of any discussion. She let out a breath. Good. They'll come back, he said. When they do, it will be about the criminal matter, not the civil one. They'll offer something in exchange for a reduced scope of the criminal complaint. What would they offer? Formal withdrawal of the water rights challenge. Possibly acknowledgement of the pattern conduct, in terms their client can live with legally. He paused. Possibly financial damages, though that conversation will take longer. Lenora was quiet for a moment. And the other properties, she said. The Clements, the Garcias, Verna Hassett. Any settlement negotiation would need to address the broader pattern. I've already told them that implicitly. Holt looked at her. You're not just fighting for your property anymore, Mrs. Whitlock. You may not have been for a while. She knew that. She'd known it since the Saturday meeting in her kitchen when Verna Hassett had walked out with Holt's contact information and the look of a woman who intended to make full use of it. What does the hearing judge know about all of this? Enough to proceed. The criminal matter is separate from his jurisdiction, but he's aware of it. A judge who sees a civil property dispute intersecting with an active criminal investigation proceeds carefully. Holt's expression was measured, which works in your favor. The hearing was on a Tuesday. It was held in the county seat, 12 miles from Briar Mesa, in a building that served 3 functions on different days of the week and smelled like pine resin and old paper. Lenora rode out with Holt in his hired buggy and Cade on horseback alongside, because she hadn't asked him to come and he'd simply saddled his horse when she was loading the buggy, and she hadn't told him not to. Burris was there. The Clements were there. Verna Hassett was there in a dark coat with her hair pinned severely, sitting in the gallery with the posture of someone who had waited 3 years for this particular morning. Ada Frisch was there as a potential witness, sitting quietly with her hands in her lap. Sutter was there. She saw him across the room when she came in. He was standing with 2 attorneys and a third man she didn't recognize. And he looked like a man who had spent the past 2 weeks understanding that the ground he'd been standing on had shifted significantly, and was managing that understanding with the controlled composure of someone who has been powerful long, enough to know how to lose without appearing to break. He didn't look at her. She looked at him long enough to be certain of that, and then she turned and sat down beside Holt and looked straight ahead. The hearing lasted 4 hours. It was not dramatic, mostly. Legal proceedings rarely were. In Lenora's experience, they were methodical and repetitive and had long stretches of language that accomplished things in technical terms that would have taken 2 sentences to say plainly. Holt presented the corrective affidavit, the 1,879 pre-filing acknowledgement letter, the bank records establishing continuous ownership through the gap years, and a summary of the pattern evidence from the 3 properties with similar documentation irregularities. Sutter's attorneys challenged the corrective affidavit on procedural grounds. The judge asked them 3 questions about territorial recording procedure. They answered the questions. The judge made a note. He made a lot of notes. Ada Frisch testified for 20 minutes about the county recorder's records and the gap in the acknowledgement ledger from the early 1880s. She was precise and dry and unflappable, and when Sutter's attorney tried to question her recollection of documents from years ago, she opened a folder she'd brought with her and produced the relevant pages, which she had clearly been prepared to produce for some time. Sutter's attorney sat down. At the midday break, Lenora stood in the hallway outside the hearing room and drank water from a cup Cade handed her and tried to read his face for what he thought was happening. "You're winning," he said quietly. "The judge hasn't said anything yet. He doesn't have to say anything yet. But look at how many times he asked their attorneys to repeat themselves and how many times he asked Holt to repeat himself." She thought about it. He asked Holt twice. He asked their side 11 times. Cade handed her a second cup. "Judges ask you to repeat yourself when they want something in the record, clearly. They ask the other side to repeat themselves when they're giving them rope." She drank the water. "When did you become a court observer?" "Wyoming," he said. 2 years of watching a man lose what he'd built." He paused. "You're not losing." The afternoon session took 2 more hours and covered the water usage affidavit, the county boundary records, and a deposition from Graham Holt's contact in Helena regarding the status of the corrective filing and the timeline of Sutter's formal challenge relative to the correction's completion. The judge recessed without ruling. He would issue a written decision within 30 days. Sutter's lead attorney approached Holt in the hallway as they were leaving. She watched from a distance while they talked, Holt's face neutral and professional, the attorney's face carrying the careful expression of a man who has been authorized to say something specific and is measuring his words. The conversation lasted about 4 minutes. Then they shook hands, and the attorney walked back toward Sutter. Holt came to Lenora. "He asked again about your openness to a negotiated resolution of the civil matter," Holt said. "I told him what I told him before. He said his client is prepared to consider a formal withdrawal of the water rights challenge in exchange for a reduced scope on the criminal complaint. Lenora looked across the emptying room toward Sutter. He was putting on his coat. His back was to her. "Tell them the criminal matter is not mine to reduce," she said. "That's Aldrich's jurisdiction and the territorial marshals. I can't offer anything on that." She paused. "But tell them that if their client formally withdraws the water rights challenge and provides a written acknowledgement of the pattern conduct in terms that can be used to address the Clement N. Garcia and Hassett situations, I will not be an obstacle to whatever resolution the criminal matter finds." Holt looked at her. "That's a sophisticated position." "It's a fair one," she said. He nodded and went back. The drive back to Briar Mesa was quiet for the first part. Holt reviewing his notes in the buggy, and Cade riding alongside without speaking. The afternoon was clear after all the recent storms, one of those September afternoons that Montana occasionally produces as an apology for its winters bright and still and cold enough to smell like something real. At some point, Holt dozed off against the buggy's side panel, which left Lenora holding the reins and Cade riding close enough to talk. "It's going to hold," he said. "We don't have the ruling yet. It's going to hold." He looked ahead at the road. "You know it, too." She did know it. She'd known it somewhere in the second hour of the hearing, when the judge had asked Sutter's attorney for the fourth time to clarify the basis for his procedural objection to the corrective affidavit. She'd known it and hadn't let herself feel it yet, because feeling it prematurely had costs she couldn't afford. She let herself feel a little of it now in the quiet of the road, with the afternoon light coming sideways through the aspen trees. "What happens to you now?" she asked. Cade glanced at her. "What do you mean?" "The roof is finished. The barn damage is being repaired. The hearing is done." She kept her eyes on the road. "You came here to fix a roof." He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "I did," he said. "Yeah, the job is finished, most of it." She looked at him. "Which part isn't?" He held her gaze for a moment in that way he had not evasive, just careful, like a man reading ground before he steps. "The east barn section still needs a proper rebuild," he said. "What Hector patched will hold the season, but it's not right." "That's true," she said. "Be ashamed to leave it wrong." She turned back to the road. "Be ashamed," she agreed. They rode the rest of the way in the kind of quiet that has something underneath it, not uncomfortable, not empty, but carrying weight that neither of them was quite ready to set down in the open yet. Holt slept through most of it. The horses knew the road home. The sun was going when they pulled into the Whitlock yard, and Hector came out to take the horses, and the farmhouse was lit from inside, the way it always was at this hour, warm against the coming dark, the repaired roof holding solid against the sky above it. Cade dismounted and stood looking at the barn's east section. Lenora stood beside him looking at it too. 2 weeks, he said. Maybe 3, if the weather holds. "I'll have Hector get the lumber order in," she said. He nodded. She went inside. He stood in the yard a moment longer, looking at the work that still needed doing, and the house that was holding, and the windmill that turned clean in the evening air, and something in his face in that moment, something that was not quite resolved and not quite at peace, but was moving in that direction, was the face of a man who was, for the first time in a long time, looking at a place and calculating not how soon he could leave, but how long it was going to take to get it right. He went to put up his horse. The letter from Sutter's attorneys arrived the following Monday. It was 4 pages, precise and legal, and signed by both of his Billings attorneys. It formally withdrew the water rights challenge with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled. It acknowledged, in carefully chosen language that Holt read 3 times and said was as close to an admission of pattern conduct as an attorney could write without exposing his client to additional civil liability, that the procedural gaps in the Clement grazing agreement and 2 other named properties, the Garcia eastern boundary, and a third Lenora hadn't even known about, a family named Pryor north of town, had occurred during a period of questionable documentation practices that Sutter's operation was committed to addressing. It did not say Sutter had done it deliberately. It did not name Crane beyond acknowledging his former employment. It was crafted to close a door without leaving fingerprints on the handle. But the door was closed. Holt sat across from Lenora at the kitchen table and said, "This is a win." She read the letter a second time. "Is it enough for the others?" she said. "The Clements? Verna? It's a starting point. The acknowledgement of pattern conduct is something their attorneys can use in subsequent negotiations." He folded his hands. It won't give them back everything they lost, but it gives them standing to ask. She put the letter down. And the criminal matter? Aldrich is in contact with the territorial marshal. With Crane in custody and the ledger as evidence, the criminal investigation will proceed independently of what Sutter's attorneys put in that letter. He paused. Sutter may face charges. He may not. That's the marshal's determination, not mine and not yours. But Crane is looking at criminal charges that his employer is not going to help him avoid, Holtz said. That's a consequence of choosing to run. Lenora sat with the letter for a moment, and she looked up and said, "What do I owe you?" Holt named a figure. It was less than she expected. "That's not enough," she said. "It's what I'm charging," he said. "I don't often get cases that become something larger than they started." He picked up his leather case. "Some of my fee will come from the Clement matter and the Hassett matter if they go forward. Consider your account settled." He left that afternoon on the billing stage. Cade started on the barn's east section the next morning. He'd drawn up a proper plan which he showed Lenora at breakfast, a clean diagram on brown paper showing the framing sequence and the load calculations, and he walked her through it, not because she needed to approve it, but because he'd apparently decided that. Explaining his reasoning was something he did with her now. She looked at the diagram for a while. "This is more solid than the original," she said. "The original wasn't adequate for the roof load," he said. "Should have been heavier framing from the start. Edmund built this barn in '78. I know. He did pretty well for what he had to work with." Cade folded the diagram. "This will do better." She poured him a second coffee before he went out, which she'd started doing somewhere in the past few weeks, as a reflex rather than a decision. He took it without comment. She watched him go out into the morning and pick up his tools and begin. She thought about what Holt had said. This is a win. She thought about Edmund's journal. She handles more than she should have to, I noticed. She thought about 18 months of early mornings and late accounts and fence lines and calving and letters to attorneys and wires to Helena and a room full of neighbors learning to talk to each other and a storm and a gate and a young man. Sitting in her kitchen deciding to say what he knew. She thought about a roof that had been rebuilt properly and was still standing. She took her coffee to the window and watched Cade work in the early light and allowed herself, quietly and without performance, the full weight of what she had held on to. Every acre, every right, everything that mattered. Still hers. The East Barn section took 3 weeks and 4 days. Cade had estimated 3 weeks if the weather held, and the weather did not hold. There were 2 days of hard rain in the second week that stopped work entirely, and one morning where the temperature dropped fast enough to make the lumber contract in. Ways that required adjustments he hadn't planned for. So it took longer. That was how building went. You made a plan, and the material and the weather and your own miscalculations had opinions about the plan, and the work took as long as it took. Lenora didn't push him on the timeline. She had the harvest to manage and the fall cattle count in a letter from Holt, updating Hermit and Hassett negotiations, which were proceeding slowly but proceeding. She also had the judge's written ruling, which arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in an envelope with the territorial court's seal on it. She read it alone at the kitchen table. Then she put it down and sat for a moment. Then she went out to the barn. Cade was up in the new framing, setting the last of the ridge beam connections, working with the particular focused quiet of a man near the end of a job he's done carefully. He heard her come in and looked down. She held up the envelope. He came down the ladder. He read it standing up, the way he read most things she handed him. The ruling was 12 pages of territorial court language, but the operative section was on page 3, and she watched his eyes find it. The water rights challenge was formally denied. The corrective affidavit was accepted as valid. Lenora Whitlock retained full and uncontested water rights to the creek crossing and all associated downstream usage on the Whitlock Ranch property. He handed the ruling back. "Congratulations," he said. "That's all?" she said. He almost smiled. "What do you want me to say?" "I don't know," she said. "Something." He looked at her for a moment. "You won," he said. "Not because someone helped you. Because you made the right decisions under pressure and didn't quit when it would have been easier to quit." He paused. "That's worth something." "It is," she said. "So is the person who made some of those decisions possible." He looked away, back up at the ridge beam. "Beam needs setting before the temperature drops again," he said. She let him go back to work. He finished the barn on a Friday. She knew it was done because the sounds from the barn changed the rhythm of construction giving way to the quieter sounds of cleanup, of tools being organized, of a man doing the last small things that signal completion. She was in the yard checking the fence posts along the east boundary when she heard it change, and she stood with her hand on a post and listened to the difference. By the time she walked back to the yard, he was outside the barn with his tools packed and his horse tied at the post nearest the bunkhouse. He was checking his saddle rigging with the methodical attention of someone preparing for a journey rather than a short ride into town. She stopped. She had known this moment was coming. She had known it since the first week. When Hector had said different doesn't mean he stays. She had known it more clearly the morning she'd handed him the coffee without thinking about it, and he'd taken it without comment and gone out into the early light, because that kind of ordinary, unspoken routine was the exact kind of thing that ended when the job ended. She knew it. That didn't make watching him check the rigging any easier. She crossed the yard. He heard her coming and glanced up, then went back to the strap he was adjusting. "Done," she said. "Done." He tested the tension on the saddle. "I'll send my final bill from wherever I land next. Give me a week." "All right." He pulled the strap through the buckle. "Cade," she said. "The ridge beam is solid," he said, not looking at her. "The east framing will carry the load. The barn will stand another 20 years if you don't let the ventilation gap on the south wall go unattended. Hector knows which board it is." "I'm not worried about the barn," she said. He stopped adjusting the strap. He didn't turn around yet. "I know you're not," he said, to the saddle, to the horse, to the general direction of away from her face. "Then stop telling me about the barn and turn around," she said. Turned around. She had prepared things to say. She had thought about this in the practical, forward-looking way. She thought about most things, identified the problem, considered the approaches, decided what needed to be said plainly and without decoration. But standing in front of him, in the October morning, with the light coming off the mountains and the repaired barn solid at his back, all of the prepared things felt wrong. So she said the true thing instead. "I wish I were 20 years older," she said. He stared at her. "What?" "Because maybe then you'd stop treating me like I'm too good for you and finally admit you love me." The yard was very quiet. A long moment passed. He looked at her the way he looked at structural problems carefully, assessing, trying to find where the weakness was in something that appeared solid. And then he looked at her the way he almost never looked at anything, which was without any of that calculation at all. He took his boot out of the stirrup. "I'm not good at staying," he said. "I want to be honest about that. I've been drifting since I was 19 years old, and I don't have a good reason for most of it, except that it was easier than—" He stopped. "Then what?" she said. "Then caring about something enough to be afraid of losing it." He looked at his hands. "That's not a proud thing to admit." "No," she said. "But it's a true thing." "That's better than proud." He looked up at her. "I've wanted you since about the second week," he said. "Not the way men want women they think are beautiful, though you are, and I noticed, and that's not what I mean. I wanted—" He paused again, struggling with the language in the way that genuinely felt things resist being made into words. "I wanted to be the kind of man who had something worth offering you. And I kept not being that man. Who told you that you weren't? Nobody had to tell me. I could see what you were and what I wasn't." Lenora looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 18 months of doing everything alone. She thought about Edmund, who had been good and kind and not quite enough. She thought about what she'd actually needed in the worst months of the dispute, not rescue, not someone to carry the weight, but someone to sit at the table and think alongside her and not flinch at what was true. "You repaired things nobody asked you to repair," she said. "You sat at my kitchen table at midnight and helped me draft letters to attorneys. You rode back up a flooding creek in a storm with cracked ribs because you weren't going to let me go alone." She held his gaze. "And you never once told me what to do. Do you know how rare that is?" He was quiet. "I don't need a man with more land than I have," she said. "I don't need someone to rescue me or manage me or treat this ranch like it becomes his just because he stays. I need—" She stopped because she was going to get the words right. "I need the man who was already here, the one who fixed the windmill because it was broken and told me the truth about the beam when he could have taken the easy money and left." He looked at her for a long time. "I'm 31 years old," he said. "I own a horse and a set of tools." "I know what you own," she said. "I know what you're worth. Those are different things." Something moved through his face, not quite breaking, but shifting. The way a structure settles when the load finally distributes right. "Lenora," he said. "Just stay," she said. Not because I need someone to run this ranch. Because I want you specifically, and I'm not interested in pretending otherwise." He crossed the distance between them. He put his hands on her face the way a man handles something he's afraid of dropping, and he kissed her in the October morning in the yard of the Whitlock Ranch, with the mountains behind him and the wind off the peaks and the barn standing solid at his back. And it was not graceful, and it was not a conclusion. It was the beginning of something that would be complicated and imperfect, and entirely worth it. They married the following October, a full year later, which was the right amount of time. Not because Lenora was uncertain, because she was careful, and because there was still work to be done, and because she had learned slowly, the way you learn things that matter, that the best structures are built without shortcuts. The wedding was small. Hector was there, and Duro and Burris and his wife, and the Clements, and Verna Hassett, who brought a fruit cake that could have been used for construction purposes, and which everyone ate without complaint, because Verna was not someone you declined food from. Ada Frisch came. Holt sent a letter from Billings that Lenora read to herself and then put away in the trunk that had been Edmund's. The ranch remained the Whitlock Ranch. Lenora's name stayed on the deed. She had been clear about this from the beginning, and Cade had never argued it, because he understood that what she'd fought to keep was hers in a way that didn't change just because she loved someone. Cade built a carpenter's workshop on the south side of the barn in the spring after their first winter together. He used the leftover framing lumber from the east section rebuild, which was the kind of economy that Lenora appreciated, and Cade considered obvious. Within a year, he had more work in Briar Mesa than he could easily manage ranchers who needed barns rebuilt, a family who needed a proper house put up on their new claim, the livery owner, who had been meaning to replace his rotting floor joists for 3 years, and finally had someone he trusted to do it right. He turned out to be well suited to having somewhere to come back to. That surprised him more than anyone. The territorial marshal's investigation into Sutter concluded the following spring. Crane accepted a plea arrangement that included 18 months of supervised labor in exchange for full cooperation with the investigation. His testimony, combined with the ledger, produced enough documented evidence of deliberate manipulation of property records that Sutter faced formal charges on 3 counts of fraudulent property conduct. He did not go to prison. His attorneys were good, and the territorial court moved slowly, and money had its usual influence over outcomes, but he paid substantial damages to the Clement family and to the Pryors north of town, and the order required him to produce and properly refile the documentation for every property transaction, going back to 1879, that showed the same recording gap pattern. It cost him more than the creek crossing would have been worth. More importantly, it cost him the certainty he'd operated with for 15 years, the certainty that he could pick off isolated landowners one at a time because they wouldn't talk to each other, wouldn't have the resources to fight, and wouldn't have anyone sitting at their table, helping them see the shape of what was being done to them. The coalition Lenora had started with a kitchen table full of frightened neighbors didn't dissolve after the investigation ended. It formalized slowly and perfectly, with arguments at meetings and disagreements about scope, and 2 families who dropped out, for reasons never fully explained, into a ranchers' cooperative that pooled resources for legal consultation and maintained a shared record of boundary and water documentation for every member property. Burris chaired it. Lenora served as secretary for the first 3 years, handling the correspondence with the thoroughness she brought to everything. Verna Hassett attended every meeting and argued about everything, and was usually right. The farmhouse roof that Cade had rebuilt in those first uncertain weeks held through 6 Montana winters without significant repair. The 7th winter brought an ice load that would have collapsed the original structure entirely, and the rebuilt section flexed and held and lost 3 shingles that Cade replaced in the spring in an afternoon. Their life was not easy in the way that stories sometimes make lives sound when they've reached their resolution. There were bad cattle years and fence disputes with a new neighbor who didn't know the county's history and had to be educated patiently about it. There were seasons when the ranch barely broke even, and Cade's building work carried them, and other seasons when the ranch ran well, and Cade had a slow month, and they balanced each other out without drama. There were arguments, because Lenora had opinions about how things should be run, and Cade had opinions about structural load, and neither of them was inclined toward silence when they disagreed. There was a daughter born in the 3rd year of their marriage, And the terror of that, the particular terror of loving something that fragile with that much of yourself, was something neither of them had words for. So they didn't use words for it, just did what needed doing and loved her in the way ordinary life permits, which is not constantly and not perfectly, but persistently and without reservation. Lenora named her after nobody, a new name for a person who hadn't existed before and didn't need to carry anyone else's weight. People in Briar Mesa sometimes talked about the Whitlock Ranch, the way people talk about things that turned out differently than expected. They talked about the widow who had refused Sutter's offer when everyone thought she'd eventually give. They talked about the carpenter who had come for 3 weeks and stayed for the rest of his life. They talked about the water rights case that had started with one woman and a rotting beam and had ended up in the territorial records as a precedent for how pattern conduct in property documentation should be assessed. Most of them got the surface of it right. A few of them understood what was underneath. What was underneath was simpler than it looked from the outside and harder than it sounded when you said it plainly. Lenora Whitlock had survived the death of a husband, the pressure of a powerful enemy, a legal system that required her to prove what should have been obvious, and a storm that tried to take what she'd spent 18 months defending. She had survived all of it without becoming someone else, without getting hard in the wrong places, without deciding that needing anyone was a weakness. That last part was the hardest. It always is. There is a particular stubbornness that people who have been left alone with hard things tend to develop a self-sufficiency that starts as survival and calcifies into armor, until the armor stops protecting you from the bad things and starts keeping out the good ones too. Lenora had felt that calcification beginning. She recognized it, and she'd made a choice against it, which was not a triumphant or a simple choice. It was a daily one, made repeatedly, sometimes reluctantly, in the ordinary moments of a life shared with someone. Cade had made his own version of that choice. He had spent years traveling light because light was how you avoided losing things, and he had not understood until he stopped moving that what he was actually avoiding was caring enough about anything to be changed by it. You cannot be changed by a place you're only passing through. You cannot be changed by a person if you leave before it happens. He'd been changed. It showed up in small ways. In the way he knew where everything was on the Whitlock property without thinking about it, the way you know a place you've stopped being a guest in the way he talked about the ranch's future rather than its present, in the way he'd started teaching the daughter to identify structural problems in buildings, pointing out where a lintel was undersized, where a foundation was showing stress, and the daughter had started pointing them out herself, with the satisfaction of someone who has been given a useful way to see the world. That was what staying could mean if you let it. Not the end of yourself. The beginning of something larger than you could have been alone. 20 years after Cade Holloway first rode up the drive and told Lenora Whitlock the truth about a rotting beam, the farmhouse roof he'd built was still standing. The barn's east section was still standing. The windmill he'd repaired in the first weeks, the one Hector had pointed out, as evidence of a man who fixed things because he noticed they were broken, still turned on most mornings, though it had been serviced twice since then, and had a new coupling that Cade had replaced himself. The Whitlock Ranch was smaller than Sutter's had been at its peak, and it would never be the largest operation in the county, and that was fine. It ran cattle and kept its water rights and its fences in good repair and its accounts in honest order, and it employed 3 full-time hands and contributed to the cooperative that had been keeping larger men honest for 2 decades now. Lenora was 54. Cade was 51. Neither of them moved as easily as they once had, which they had both been informed about at length by their daughter, who had her mother's practicality and her father's eye for what needed fixing, and an opinion about everything that she delivered, with a directness that made Verna Hassett, who had known her since birth, say approvingly that the girl had come out right. On a September morning very like the ones they'd spent 20 years before, cold and clear, the light off the mountains making the yard look like something worth fighting. For Lenora stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched Cade cross the yard toward the workshop. He was favoring his left side slightly, the way he always did when the weather turned cold. That rib had healed with a hitch in it that never entirely went away. He knew it was there and managed around it and declined to discuss it, which was his prerogative. He paused at the workshop door and looked back at the house. He couldn't see her through the window glass, but he looked back anyway, the way he always did, not searching, just orienting. The way you look back at the place where someone you love is, even when you can't see them. Then he went inside and began his work. She drank her coffee. The ranch was quiet in the September morning, except for the sound of the windmill and the distant noise of cattle in the south pasture, and, after a moment, the clean and steady sounds of a man who knew what he was doing and was doing it in a place he had chosen. There are people who go through their whole lives looking for the thing that will finally make them feel like they belong somewhere. Some of them find it. Some of them don't. Some of them had it within reach and left before they understood what they were leaving. Cade Holloway had almost been the last kind. He had ridden up a drive to fix a roof and found something he hadn't known he was missing. And he'd been afraid of it in the particular way that only the things you actually want can frighten you, not because they're dangerous, but because losing them would matter. He'd stayed anyway. That was the choice. Not dramatic, not announced. Just a boot taken out of a stirrup and a decision made toward something rather than away from it. And then 20 years of the same decision, made again in 100 smaller ways, until the decision became who he was. The beautiful widow everyone expected to lose her ranch kept everything that mattered. The wandering cowboy who had spent his life believing that belonging somewhere meant giving something up finally discovered what it actually meant. That you only get to keep the things you choose to stay for.